This horrific event took place on Christmas Eve 2022 in the town of Wallasey, located on the outskirts of Liverpool, United Kingdom. The main character of this story is 26-year-old Elle Edwards, a young and attractive girl who worked as a cosmetologist in a local beauty salon and assisted a dermatologist. Elle was a true gem of her town. Her beauty and charm captivated everyone around her, and her kindness and positivity allowed her to find common ground even with the most demanding clients. This girl was not only beautiful on the outside, but also incredibly talented in her field. Thanks to her hard work and determination, she became a first-class specialist in her areas of expertise. Elle always greeted her clients with a sincere smile, radiating joy and optimism. It seemed that everything in this girl's life was going as well as possible. She relentlessly pursued her goals and dreams, building a successful career. But despite her busy schedule, Elle never forgot about her family. She was especially looking forward to Christmas because this year her sister Lucy was supposed to fly in from faraway Dubai. Just imagine how important this reunion with her beloved sister was for Elle. She couldn't wait for her arrival, planning how they would celebrate New Year's and Christmas together. After all, it is in such moments that we feel the value of family bonds and the warmth of loved ones most acutely. But unfortunately, this story will not have a happy ending. What was supposed to be a joyful celebration turned into a real nightmare. On December 24, 2022, Elle went to a local pub with her friends to celebrate Christmas while waiting for Lucy's arrival. They had no idea that this night would be fatal for them. As an experienced detective, I have encountered similar cases more than once. Even in the brightest moments of our lives, evil may be lurking nearby, and while we carelessly celebrate, someone may be planning the most terrible things. This is exactly what happened on that Christmas night in Wallasey when someone's bloody revenge destroyed the life of an innocent girl and her loved ones. Elle Edwards and her girlfriends decided to celebrate the long-awaited reunion with a bang. They chose the local pub, the Lighthouse, for this, where they planned to have a fun time while waiting for the arrival of Elle's sister Lucy. The girls could not even imagine that this night would turn into a real nightmare for them. The pub was filled with an atmosphere of joy and carefree fun. Elle and her friends laughed, danced, and sang karaoke, enjoying the festive mood. They were so caught up in the merriment that they did not notice how a person who had nothing to do with kindness and mercy appeared nearby. The Christmas idol was shattered at 23:50 when an alarming call came into the rescue service. Witnesses reported that at least 12 shots were fired at the exit of the pub, and worst of all, 2 bullets hit Elle directly. One of them seriously wounded the girl in the head. The dispatcher immediately sent emergency services to the scene. Medics urgently arrived at the pub and, having loaded Elle into an ambulance, rushed to the local hospital. They did everything possible to save the girl's life, but unfortunately, her injuries were incompatible with life. Elle died on the way to the hospital. When the police informed the family of the deceased about the tragedy, it came as a real shock to them. No one could believe that this could happen to their beloved Elle. This girl was the epitome of kindness, beauty, and joy. She had many friends, and it seemed that she could not have enemies capable of such cruelty. As an experienced detective, I understood that the investigation of this crime would not be easy. In the early stages, the investigators had no leads. The attacker appeared out of nowhere, committed his bloody massacre, and disappeared just as without a trace, leaving only shell casings and Elle's lifeless body behind. The nature of the attack indicated that it was carefully planned. The criminal thought out every step, not leaving his victim any chance of salvation. But the question that haunted us was whether Elle was the real target of the attack, or perhaps she became an accidental victim of some madman. When I heard what happened next, my breath caught in my throat from the tension. An unknown car stopped at the entrance to the pub, and a few minutes later, the shooting began. In addition to the deceased, 4 more men received gunshot wounds of varying degrees of severity. All of them were young people aged 22 to 33 who were spending time at the establishment that evening and lived in nearby suburbs. The police initially leaned towards the version that the murdered woman was an accidental victim. It was known that criminal groups periodically operated here, and the shooting probably became an ordinary showdown between their members. However, all this was just speculation that needed to be proven or disproven during the investigation, so the detectives studied the victim's personality in more detail. Elle's father, named Tim, was shocked by what happened. Just a few hours before the murder, he spoke with his daughter on the phone. They had a nice conversation and discussed the packing of Christmas gifts that Tim was doing. Like the witnesses of the crime, the victim's relatives did not think who could have wished for Elle's death. The girl seemed to have no ill wishes or enemies who could be capable of such horrors. The detectives decided to interview other witnesses and victims of the unknown criminal's bullets. In addition, law enforcement officers requested video surveillance footage from the pub owner. It was necessary to talk to dozens of people and analyze several hours of video recording. Friends, a very important point: the creation of such content requires a lot of time, and now my channel and I are going through a difficult financial situation. I will be immensely grateful to you if you become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. And in return, I will be able to personally respond to you in the comments and also mention your noble name in my video. So become sponsors, I will be immensely grateful to you. Eyewitnesses reported that shortly before the shooting, an unknown car stopped at the entrance to the pub, and just a few minutes later, shots rang out, taking the life of Elle and injuring 4 more young men. These guys, aged 22 to 33, just like Elle, were simply spending time at the Lighthouse pub on that fatal evening. They did not even suspect that they would become victims of a brutal attack. All the injured were local residents who lived in the nearest suburbs of Wallasey. At the beginning of the investigation, we had a version that Elle could have been an accidental victim of the shooting. The fact is that this was not the calmest area of the city. Local criminal groups periodically operated here, so the first thought was that the shooting could be related to a showdown between gangs. But as an experienced detective, I'll say that it's not worth jumping to conclusions. These were just guesses that needed careful verification. Therefore, the cops began to study in more detail the personality of the deceased girl to understand if she could have enemies capable of such a terrible crime. The investigators decided to question other witnesses of the tragedy and victims of the unknown shooter's bullets. Perhaps one of them noticed something important that could shed light on this dark story. Also, law enforcement requested video surveillance footage from the pub owner. This was a chance to track the movement of the criminal and understand how he ended up near the lighthouse on that fatal night. Even with my experience working in the police, I was stunned by what happened next. Pay attention to some details regarding the car that the criminal was driving. This information turned out to be quite contradictory because witnesses of the event described the vehicle differently. Due to the darkness and panic, it was extremely difficult to see anything specific. However, after a thorough analysis of all the testimonies, the most likely version was a dark-colored Mercedes A-Class. And this guess was confirmed when the police studied the footage from external video surveillance cameras. An interesting fact was that the killer did not immediately open fire on the visitors of the pub. At first, he drove into the parking lot and for some time simply observed what was happening inside the establishment. It seemed that the attacker was waiting for something or someone. From the place where he stopped the car, there was an excellent view of the entrance to the pub and most of the premises. Obviously, the attacker was waiting for the most opportune moment for his bloody attack, and that moment came when Elle appeared on the street. The criminal quickly jumped out of the car, fired 12 shots into the crowd, and then just as quickly returned to the driver's seat and disappeared in an unknown direction. After a thorough study of all the surveillance camera recordings, the investigators came to an important conclusion: the attacker acted alone. There were no signs that anyone was helping him. Unfortunately, it was not possible to track the exact escape route of the criminal. Therefore, the police had to resort to a large-scale door-to-door survey. They talked to every resident of the neighborhood, describing the car and the circumstances of the crime, hoping to obtain at least some lead that would help identify the killer. Patrolling the streets of Wallasey took place around the clock, and these efforts were not in vain. Just 2 days after the shooting, detectives managed to detain 2 suspects at once. The police immediately informed the public and the media about this, but the names of the detainees were not disclosed until all the circumstances of the case were fully clarified. The only thing that became known was that the suspects were a 30-year-old man and a 19-year-old girl, but the investigation failed to prove their involvement in this terrible crime. During searches in the homes of the detainees, the weapon from which people were shot at near the pub was not found. Even now, as I'm telling you about this, I feel goosebumps running down my spine. After unsuccessful attempts to detain the real perpetrators of this terrible crime, the local police decided to make an official statement. They assured the public that they would not rest until the unknown shooter was behind bars and brought to justice. This statement was intended to at least slightly reassure the local residents of Wallasey, who were extremely outraged by the rampant crime on the streets of their city and the obvious powerlessness of the authorities. People felt unprotected and left to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, during the investigation, a new version emerged regarding the possible reasons for the attack. It was assumed that the shooting in the Lighthouse pub could be due to enmity between local gangster groups, and Elle, in this case, was just an accidental victim who simply found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, it is worth noting that at that moment, these were only guesses that required thorough verification. The investigators had yet to find strong evidence that would confirm or refute this version. During further investigation, it was established that the potential targets of the shooter that night could have been Jake Duffy and Kieran Seld, members of one of the local gangs who were also relaxing in the pub on that ill-fated evening. As it turned out, these two had been in a fierce confrontation with another criminal group for a long time, which was trying to establish control over this part of the city. So it is quite likely that it was this enmity that could have caused the bloody massacre. On December 29, law enforcement officers managed to detain another suspect in this case. But as in the case with those previously arrested, it was not possible to prove his involvement in the shooting. The man had a reliable alibi that completely excluded him from the circle of suspects in the commission of this particular crime. However, the detectives assumed that the detainee could have been involved in organizing the attack. Perhaps he played the role of an accomplice or a spotter, but it was extremely difficult to prove this. Around the same time, the investigation finally managed to identify the car that the shooter was driving. It turned out to be a dark Mercedes that the criminal left in the parking lot near the pub. True, due to the lack of direct evidence, the name of the owner of this car was also not disclosed. But finding this car was not so easy. Detectives had to carefully study the footage from numerous video cameras. What happened next can only be compared to the plot of a high-octane thriller. At the time when it seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end, an event occurred that could have been a real breakthrough in this intricate case. On December 31, the police received a report of a fire that happened very close to the place where the attack on the visitors of the pub was committed. When our colleagues arrived at the call, they saw a shocking picture, a dark Mercedes, which, according to the description of witnesses, very much resembled the car of the criminals, was completely engulfed in flames. The vehicle was burning like a torch, and it was clear that it could no longer be saved. This was a real blow to the investigation. After all, not only possible material evidence that could shed light on the identities of the attackers burned in the fire, but also perhaps the murder weapon itself. The experts could only throw up their hands. The chances of finding something valuable after such a fire were practically zero. Of course, the detectives immediately suspected that this was an intentional arson. The criminals, apparently, felt that the police were getting close to revealing their identities and decided to destroy all possible evidence of their involvement in this bloody massacre. However, even despite the fact that the fire left almost no traces, forensic scientists still managed to establish one important detail: this Mercedes was used during the attack on the pub. True, the car itself did not belong to the criminals, but was stolen shortly before the tragic events of Christmas night. Such a brazen attempt to hide traces only confirmed the investigators' guesses that representatives of the criminal world were behind the shooting. It is quite likely that the arson was only one of the elements of a carefully planned operation to eliminate competitors. It would seem that after this, the investigation would again find itself at a dead end. But on January 11, a real breakthrough occurred. Two suspects in this case were delivered to the police station at once. They turned out to be a 22-year-old man and a 23-year-old woman who were detained in central Wales. The young man, who was called Connor Chapman, was of particular interest to the detectives. Why? Because he was already well known to law enforcement officers for his criminal biography. Over the past 5 years before the murder of L. Edwards, Chapman managed to light up in numerous offences and crimes. Connor started, like many others, with minor violations of the law. But over time, his appetites grew, and he plunged deeper and deeper into the criminal swamp. It seemed that this guy was not going to stop there at all, and in every possible way sought to establish himself in the status of a reckless criminal. The detention of Chapman certainly added optimism to the investigation. It only remained to hope that the interrogation of this suspect would finally provide answers to the questions that had been haunting all of Ollie Swilge for so long. After all, every resident of this small town wanted only one thing: that those guilty of the death of innocent L would be brought to justice. I almost fell off my chair when I heard what happened next. I would like to focus your attention on the personality of one of the main suspects, Connor Chapman. His biography is a prime example of how a person can find himself on the wrong path and eventually slide to the very bottom of the criminal world. As it became known from police archives, one of Connor's first serious crimes was car theft. And this was not an ordinary theft. The guy committed this crime under aggravating circumstances. That is, from the very beginning of his criminal career, Chapman acted boldly and uncompromisingly. Later, his name began to appear in case files about robberies, hooliganism, and threats. It seemed that this young man was simply incapable of living according to the law and received some kind of perverse pleasure from violating all possible rules and norms. Once Connor even became a participant in a real Hollywood-style chase. Fleeing from the police, he abandoned the stolen car and tried to hide in the bushes. And even when he was caught up and detained by law enforcement officers, this young criminal managed to make a surprised face and declare that he did not understand at all what the chase in question was about. According to him, he was just waiting in those bushes for his friend. Chapman's cynicism knew no bounds. But it was this very adventure that made him truly famous. The press started talking about the desperate guy. His name flashed on the front pages of local newspapers. Interestingly, Connor grew up in Birkenhead, a suburb of Liverpool, under the care of his grandmother and grandfather. His parents left the boy in early childhood, so the elderly relatives had to take care of raising their grandson. Despite all their efforts, Connor embarked on a criminal path early. Chapman's problems with the law began in his teens. He dropped out of school shortly before the final exams, although to be honest, no one had any particular hopes for him. The guy had always studied poorly and was considered a problem child. Connor first found himself in the dock in 2014 when he was only 14. Then he was accused of shoplifting. Who knows, maybe it was the lenient sentence for this crime that inspired the teenager to further offenses. Already in 2016, Chapman again came to the attention of law enforcement. This time he was caught during another car theft. The guy was detained right in the stolen car, behind the wheel of which he was without a license and insurance. Moreover, by his actions, Connor violated the conditions of the previous sentence, according to which he was released early. Another year passed, and in 2017 Chapman distinguished himself again. This time, in addition to the traditional car theft, there was also the possession of prohibited psychotropic substances. And again, the guy ignored all the prohibitions and warnings, because at that time he was already under police supervision. The denouement of this story turned out to be so shocking that I still can't find the words to describe my emotions. As a result of his illegal actions, the guy was banned from visiting several areas of the city. He was clearly ordered not to appear in public places, because with his behavior he posed a real threat to others. But could such bans stop Connor? Already the next year, 2018, he again came to the attention of the police when he was detained during a patrol. And again in a public place and with weapons and prohibited substances. It's hard to believe that this guy had barely turned 18 at the time. It was then that Connor Chapman's name first hit the pages of newspapers. This happened after his next attempt to escape from law enforcement officers in a stolen car. Patrolmen noticed a local Audi on the street that was moving with violations. They immediately demanded that the driver stop and get out of the car with his hands raised. But Connor was not going to give up so easily. He sharply pressed on the gas and began to flee, provoking a real chase in the style of action movies. During this crazy race, the young criminal managed to violate, it seems, all possible traffic rules. Chapman constantly exceeded the speed limit, accelerating to 80 km/h where the maximum allowed speed was 30. He repeatedly drove into the oncoming lane, risking not only his own life, but also the safety of other road users. The finale of this story was quite expected. Unable to cope with the control on the next maneuver, Connor crashed into the curb. From a strong impact, the car was turned around and thrown to the side of the road. The hapless driver himself miraculously managed to get out of the mangled car unharmed. But his adventures that day did not end there. Jumping out of the wrecked car, Connor rushed headlong to flee, trying to hide from the police in the roadside bushes. However, this did not help him. The patrol officers caught up with the fugitive after only a few hundred meters. And even in this seemingly hopeless situation, Chapman managed to wriggle out. When he was being detained, the guy stated with an absolutely sincere look that he was just waiting in those bushes for his buddy. Of course, no one believed this excuse. His lie was too obvious. During the trial, Connor's lawyer tried to justify his client, claiming that he simply fell under the harmful influence of older comrades. Like Chapman himself is not a bad person who should not be thrown behind bars, but released to freedom, giving a chance to reform. The defender even stated that his client allegedly had attention deficit disorder and a whole bunch of other mental disorders. However, all these tricks did not help. The court found Connor guilty on all charges. The motive for the murder was as simple as a door. It was competition between two local gangs. Connor simply blindly killed an innocent person to satisfy the needs of the gang who were dividing this territory at the time, and after which he was supposed to go to Spain to cover his tracks. This scoundrel was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to early release after 48 years. The guy also received a ban on driving a car, which was in effect after his release. Thus, the novice criminal achieved 14 convictions for 30 criminal episodes by the time he reached the age of majority. Obviously, he was not going to change and categorically refused to fit into society. Everyone understood that he was potentially dangerous, but there were no legal grounds for isolating him from the father of the murdered woman. Announced his desire to organize a fund to support victims similar to his daughter. He believed that the main goal would be to fight for a reduction in the number of weapons in the hands of civilians. The bereaved man wanted this tragic accident to become a lesson and help save the lives of the same innocent people in the future. It all began in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, located in the heart of America. This place is considered ideal for young people who aspire to start a family and raise children. It would seem that for Joshua and Amber, a young couple expecting their first child, Tulsa should have been a cozy nest where they could build their happy future. However, as often happens in life, reality turned out to be quite different. Amber, an 18-year-old high school graduate, was an excellent student and actively engaged in sports. She was a member of the Future Farmers of America Club, which demonstrated her determination and ambition. Amber had lived with her mother and stepfather in Tulsa since she was 5 years old. Joshua, a 22-year-old native of Tulsa, was also an outstanding athlete. Following in the footsteps of his father, a career officer, he decided to pursue a career in the U.S. Armed Forces. His brother Zach, also a military man, was undergoing training before being deployed to Afghanistan. From the outside, Amber and Joshua seemed like the perfect couple, an attractive girl and a handsome, charming pilot. It appeared that they had a bright and happy future ahead of them. Both had loving families and strong ties in the community. However, as a detective with many years of experience, I can say that appearances are often deceiving. Behind the perfect facade, serious problems and conflicts can lurk, which only intensify over time. Even I, a seasoned detective, was struck by what I heard next. For those who observed their relationship from the outside, everything seemed like a fairy tale. A young couple in love who, without wasting time, decided to get married. Just a few days before Joshua finished military technical school, on September 7, 2010, the couple tied the knot and threw a lavish celebration. However, reality turned out to be not so cloudless. Joshua received an assignment to serve in faraway Alaska, thousands of miles away from family and friends. Amber, as a devoted wife, followed her beloved without hesitation to a small town with a harsh climate and an unfamiliar way of life. She took on the task of setting up a new home and establishing a household, trying to create a cozy atmosphere for herself and her husband. But was this the only reason for the changes in Amber's behavior? Joshua's brother Zach began to notice that the girl seemed to be trying to escape from something, immersing herself in household chores. He also had a feeling that Amber, from the very beginning of their acquaintance, controlled Joshua and manipulated him. Zach even advised his brother to stay away from the girl. However, upon learning about Amber's problems in her family and her mother's poor treatment of her, Zach suggested that the girl had developed a difficult character. Perhaps that was why she was somewhat nervous and demanding. He hoped that the courtship, marriage, and relocation would benefit Amber and help her build a relationship with Joshua. But did these hopes come true? Unfortunately, neither the move to Alaska nor the wedding could fix the situation. On the contrary, it only worsened. From my experience as a detective, I can say that serious problems often lurk behind the perfect image. Excessive control by one of the partners, manipulation, attempts to escape from reality. All these are alarming signs that point to possible future conflicts. Unfortunately, those in love often ignore these signs, hoping that everything will work out on its own. But was there something in the case of Joshua and Amber that could have prevented the tragedy? Were there moments in their relationship when something could still be changed? Joshua, while on duty, often called his brother Zach and told him about Amber's strange behavior. At first, it was obsessive calls and complaints about loneliness, which Joshua regarded as a form of psychological and emotional pressure from her side. But the problems did not end there. Soon, Joshua confessed to his family that Amber had begun to show physical aggression. She beat him and threw various objects at him. Zach, trying to help his brother, advised him to contact the military police on the base and officially document these incidents. He understood that the situation was getting out of control and required intervention. One time, Joshua told Zach about a particularly horrific incident. Amber, in a fit of aggression, hit him with a lamp and pushed him down the stairs. He also mentioned that during their stay in Alaska, his wife developed a drug problem, which only worsened the already tense situation in the family. As a detective, I can say that substance abuse often becomes a catalyst for domestic violence. People lose control of themselves and resort to aggression, destroying not only their own lives, but also the lives of their loved ones. Eventually, the command of the unit where Joshua served sent the couple for counseling, trying to save their marriage. But it seemed to be too late. Less than 9 months passed, and the situation reached a critical point. Joshua was expelled from the military academy, and the couple was forced to return home. At that point, Amber was already pregnant. It would seem that this news should have brought the couple together, become an incentive for them to start from scratch. But unfortunately, this did not happen. Amber's mother settled them in an apartment on the 25th floor of a multi-story building, which became a witness to constant quarrels and mutual accusations. Unfortunately, as often happens, people hope until the very end that everything will work out on its own, without realizing the full seriousness of the situation. What I am about to tell you now will make you look at everything you have heard before in a different way. The fateful day had come when Joshua and Amber's relationship reached the point of no return. Despite the fact that Amber was in her 7th month of pregnancy, it seemed that this only added fuel to the fire of their constant conflicts. That day, another quarrel broke out between the couple, which quickly escalated into a fight. In the heat of emotions, they knocked over the television and broke the bedroom window. This was not just a conflict, but a real brawl that threatened not only their mental health, but also their physical safety. Interestingly, just 2 days before this, Joshua had filed a request for a protective order, trying to protect himself from his wife's aggression. But unfortunately, this document remained unnoticed, lost among other papers. The broken window could not go unnoticed. The owners of the building, upon learning about the incident, contacted the couple and informed them that they had to compensate for the damages. Armand Rosales and his team were called in for repairs. When the craftsman voiced the amount of $150, it only added fuel to the fire. Another argument broke out between Joshua and Amber. Joshua insisted that he could fix everything himself, trying to save money. But in the end, perhaps tired of constant quarrels, the couple still gave their consent to the repairs. During this time, Amber, consumed by anger, entered and exited the room several times. Her behavior clearly indicated an unstable emotional state and uncontrolled aggression. Meanwhile, Joshua's packed suitcases were already standing by the door. He had gathered his belongings, documents, even CDs, preparing to leave his wife. The day before, Joshua had called his father and arranged for help with the move. But due to his father's delay at work, the young man was forced to turn to friends for help. And now, my friends, a very important point. Creating this kind of content requires a considerable amount of time, and currently, my channel and I are experiencing financial difficulties. I would be immensely grateful if you could become a sponsor of this channel and support me with your donation. In return, I will be able to personally respond to your comments and even mention your noble name in my video. So please consider becoming a sponsor. I will be endlessly thankful for your support. This scene vividly illustrates how tense and unhealthy the relationship of this couple was. Even pregnancy did not become a restraining factor or motivation for them to find common ground. Aggression, mutual offenses, and the desire to run away from problems instead of solving them, that's what characterized their marriage at that moment. In my opinion, there is a line when a conflict turns into something more than just a quarrel. And in this case, Joshua and Amber had long crossed that red line. If you thought that this story could no longer surprise you in any way, get ready to change your mind. While the couple continued to argue, Mr. Rosales, who was repairing the window, sent his assistant to the truck parked below for additional materials. Perhaps he just wanted to get away from this tense atmosphere and disputes for a while. Stepping out of the room into the corridor, Rosales began talking to a neighbor when suddenly he heard screams coming from the apartment. No, no, no. This was followed by the sound of rapid footsteps, a loud crash, and more screams. This cacophony of sounds did not bode well and indicated that the conflict between Joshua and Amber had gotten out of control. At the same moment, Rosales' assistant, who was already heading to the truck, heard the sound of breaking glass. Later in court, he would give stunning testimony. It was like in a movie. I saw this guy falling and heard him screaming and saw all the way down. Only a few seconds after that, Amber's face appeared in the broken window. This moment became a key point in the whole story. On the other side of the street, Robert Baker, who had just come out for a smoke, looked up at the sound of breaking glass and saw Joshua falling. Without wasting a second, he immediately called the rescue service, realizing the seriousness of the situation. Later in court, he would confirm that he saw the guy flying out of the window face forward. Meanwhile, Mr. Rosales returns to the apartment and comes upon a shocking scene, a broken window. Approaching closer, he looks outside, trying to understand what happened. Suddenly, Amber comes out of the room and starts screaming that her husband fell out of the window, that she pushed him. This confession stuns Rosales, and he instinctively feels fear to approach Amber, fearing that in a state of passion she might push him too. As a detective, I can say that such situations, unfortunately, are not uncommon. Domestic violence often leads to tragic consequences, especially when emotions take over reason. Amber's sincere confession immediately after the incident indicates that she may not have fully realized what she had done in a fit of anger. You will be stunned when you find out what happened next. I want to draw your attention to Amber's behavior immediately after the tragedy. Being in a state of shock, she tried to convince Mr. Rosales to go down with her to her fallen husband. Rosales agreed that, perhaps instinctively sensing danger, he led Amber to the lobby, not to the parking lot as she had asked. He even called the building manager to accompany the woman, while he himself stepped away to call the police and keep a safe distance from Amber. Rescuers, firefighters, and police quickly arrived at the scene. What they saw shocked even seasoned professionals. Amber was found next to her husband's mutilated body. She held his head, kissed him, and desperately begged everyone around for help. Later in court, firefighters would testify that Amber was screaming hysterically, begging them to save her husband at all costs, otherwise she would go to jail. One of them also noted that the woman was in such an unstable emotional state that they were even afraid that she might throw herself off the parking lot on the 8th floor. Unfortunately, it was too late for Joshua. The injuries sustained from the fall were incompatible with life. He died on the spot from a severe impact. While specialists worked at the scene of the tragedy, Amber called her grandmother and asked her to come to be with her. The police officer who was to accompany Amber to the downtown police station allowed her to wait for her grandmother. He led the woman to a part of the lobby, away from the gathering crowd of onlookers. Then the same officer drove Amber and her grandmother to the station in a patrol car. And it was during this trip that something very important happened. The police officer accidentally overheard Amber quietly confessing to her grandmother that it was she who had pushed Joshua, and because of that he fell out of the window. This confession would become a key piece of evidence in the subsequent investigation. I have encountered similar situations many times. Often, people who have committed a crime in a fit of passion then sincerely repent. They seem to not fully realize the reality of what happened and feel the need to speak out, even if it will harm them later on. At this stage, there were many questions swirling in my head. What exactly happened in that apartment? Did Amber really intentionally push Joshua? What was the relationship between the couple that led to such a tragic end? Prepare yourself for the fact that your emotions will be off the scale, because what happened next defies comprehension. As soon as Amber and her grandmother arrived at the police station, they were immediately taken to a special interrogation room. This room was equipped with everything necessary: recording devices, surveillance cameras, as well as basic items such as water and medicine. The police made sure to create the necessary conditions for conducting the interrogation and gathering information. Leaving the women alone, the officer entered the adjacent observation room. He understood that something important for the further investigation could be said now, so without wasting time, he turned on the recording. What happened next is difficult to describe in words. Amber seemed to have lost touch with reality. She began to talk to her grandmother, but her words resembled more of a delirium. "I shouldn't be here. Josh is dead, and I'm here," she repeated over and over again. Amber was aware of the full tragedy of the situation, realizing that with her actions she had ruined not only her own life. "I didn't just lose my husband. Jean and Patrick lost their son, Zach lost his brother and his grandmother. Grandma has a bad heart, and she won't survive the news of her beloved grandson's death." These words are permeated with pain, fear, and despair. Amber seemed to be reliving everything again, recalling the smallest details. "I still don't remember holding his mutilated body and just looking at him." Such memories are capable of breaking even the strongest person, and Amber was already in an extremely unstable emotional state. Amber's grandmother, a wise woman with a wealth of life experience, understood that her granddaughter needed support and consolation now more than ever. She realized that if Amber continued to blame herself, it could lead to irreparable consequences. Therefore, the grandmother began to calm the girl down, saying that Joshua was now in God's hands. She tried to give Amber at least some foothold, something to hold on to in this terrible situation. In the conversation, Amber began to recall the time spent with her husband in Alaska. And here something very important was said. It turns out that when the couple was prescribed counseling sessions, one of the counselors let slip that if Amber and Joshua stayed living together, she would eventually kill him. This information sheds new light on the whole story. Were the counselor's words just an unfortunate statement, or was there something more behind them? As a detective, I understand that every detail, even the smallest one, can be crucial. Therefore, this mention of the counselor's words will definitely be taken into account during the investigation. We need to understand whether it was just a coincidence or whether someone might have foreseen the tragic end of this story long before its climax. During the conversation with her grandmother, Amber suddenly uttered a phrase that clarifies a lot in this complicated story. She said that if she had known what it would lead to, she certainly would not have pushed Joshua. These words sounded like a kind of confession, albeit an indirect one. Amber's grandmother, upon hearing this, immediately asked, "But you didn't push him on purpose, did you?" And right away, as if trying to fix the situation, she advised her granddaughter to say that it all happened accidentally. This moment is very important because it shows that even Amber's closest people understood how serious the consequences of her words could be. Further events unfolded around the confrontation between two families, Joshua's relatives and Amber's. Each side tried to defend their truth to protect their child. Joshua's family claimed that he had tried in every way to help Amber, to give her the opportunity to start a new life away from the toxic influence of her own parents. They believed that Joshua wanted his wife to overcome a harmful addiction, give birth to a healthy child, and enjoy motherhood. However, according to them, despite all her husband's efforts, Amber continued to use prohibited substances even during pregnancy, and also abused Joshua, knowing that he loved her too much to fight back. On the other hand, Amber's family blamed everything on Joshua. They claimed that he himself was cruel and allegedly had also been taking some substances lately, which is why he fell out of the window. This version was radically different from the one voiced by the relatives of the deceased. As you can see, dear viewers, the situation was extremely complicated. Two families, two truths, and each side defended their child to the last. In such cases, it is always difficult to figure out where the truth is and where there is an attempt to justify a loved one. The local police had to unravel this tangle of family contradictions, and although both versions deserved attention, the law enforcement officers had more trust in the testimony of Joshua's relatives. After all, Amber herself admitted that she had a hand in her husband's death. That is why she was officially charged with murder. But even at this stage, many questions remained. Was it a planned, cold-blooded murder? Or was that counselor right who warned that if Amber and Joshua stayed together, he would kill him sooner or later? At that time, there was no direct evidence of intentional murder. If you thought that this story could no longer surprise you in any way, get ready to change your mind. Considering all the evidence and eyewitness testimony, the investigation concluded that it was a second-degree murder, a crime committed in a state of strong emotional distress. Witnesses who were present in the apartment and those who saw Joshua fall out of the window told about the fierce quarrels of the couple that lasted throughout the day and eventually led to the tragedy. Everything indicated that a conflict had occurred between Amber and Joshua, which got out of control and had fatal consequences. From a legal point of view, Amber's actions were qualified as something between involuntary manslaughter and negligent homicide. Her behavior during the interrogation and her own words indicated that she did not plan to kill her husband, but at the same time, her actions led to his death. Initially, Amber was released on bail as the defense began to build a line of defense and gather arguments in her favor. During this period, the woman gave birth to a boy, but unfortunately, motherhood did not keep her from further problems with the law. The conditions of Amber's stay at large before the trial were quite strict. She had to observe a curfew, constantly be under the supervision of her mother or grandmother. In addition, the woman was obliged to wear an electronic bracelet to track her movements. Amber also had to regularly submit urine tests and undergo examinations using a catheter to confirm that she was not using prohibited substances. However, as surveillance records show, Amber repeatedly violated the conditions of her release on bail. She missed the curfew or allowed her monitoring device to turn off at least 10 times. Surveillance agents also noted that Amber often asked to change her overnight location at the last minute. But the most alarming signal was that in 2 cases, traces of prohibited drugs were found in Amber's urine. There were also cases when her tests were so diluted that they could not be checked for the content of narcotic substances. All this indicated that Amber continued to lead a lifestyle that ultimately led to the tragedy. Eventually, due to regular violations of the conditions of detention, Amber was sent to the local prison pending trial. And here, even more shocking details became known. Other prisoners reported that when Amber was approached about her husband's death, she laughed and openly stated that it was she who killed the scumbag by throwing him out of the window. Of course, such testimonies required careful verification. After all, it is quite possible that these women, with whom Amber shared prison life, could distort her words or add something of their own. But in any case, this information could not be ignored by the investigation. The investigation of this case was a real challenge for everyone involved. It was necessary to gather together all the details, separate facts from rumors and emotions, and based on this, compile a clear picture of what happened. Ahead of us was a trial that was to put the final point in this tragic story. So, dear viewers, we have come to the end of this tragic story. But before putting a period on it, I want to draw your attention to some details that shed light on what happened to Amber after her arrest. Having found herself behind bars, it would seem that Amber should have reconsidered her actions and felt guilt for what she had done. However, as her cellmates testify, she continued to behave defiantly and even laughed when mentioning her husband's death. Moreover, Amber openly stated that it was she who killed Joshua by throwing him out of the window. But as soon as the woman found herself in the courtroom, her behavior changed dramatically. A completely different Amber appeared before the jury, quiet, frightened, claiming that she acted exclusively in self-defense. According to her version, Joshua attacked her, grabbed her by the shoulders, and she, defending herself, simply pushed him away. Allegedly, this is what led to the guy tripping over candlesticks and falling out of the window. However, the evidence gathered during the investigation cast doubt on the truthfulness of this testimony. A forensic medical examination showed that Joshua had suffered numerous injuries incompatible with life. He had broken legs, arms, ribs, sternum, and pelvis. In addition, serious damage to internal organs was found. At the same time, a toxicological analysis did not reveal any traces of alcohol or drugs in Joshua's body. Detectives also paid attention to the state of the crime scene. In the photographs, it is clearly visible that the massive candlesticks near the window stood motionless. There were no signs of a struggle or disorder in the room. This cast doubt on Amber's version that Joshua accidentally fell out of the window after tripping. And the window itself was unlikely to break so easily after all. The building was erected back in 1966, and the glass in it was not tempered as in modern high-rises. Amber's defense twice tried to make a deal with the prosecution, offering her to plead guilty in exchange for a mitigated sentence. But the woman stubbornly refused to compromise, insisting on her version of events. In the end, this played against her. The jury only needed 3 hours to find her guilty of second-degree murder. Amber was sentenced to 25 years in prison and a hefty fine. In addition, the court ordered her to pay for her husband's funeral expenses. The woman filed an appeal, claiming that her lawyer did not defend her interests well enough, but the higher court left the verdict unchanged. It would seem that the story should have ended there. But already in prison, Amber suddenly expressed a desire to talk to journalists. She gave an interview to the BBC, appeared on The Doctor, Phil's show, and later gave written consent for an interview with a local TV studio. However, this meeting never took place because the next day after Amber sent the letter, she was found dead in her cell. As the examination showed, the woman committed suicide by hanging herself with an electrical cord. Relatives and friends refused to believe that Amber could have committed suicide. As proof, they cited the same letter in which she agreed to an interview. However, during the autopsy, traces of self-harm were found on the woman's body, cuts on her wrists and forearms, and toxicology showed the presence of drug and antidepressant residues in her blood. So the version of suicide, unfortunately, looked quite probable. This tragic story left no one indifferent, neither Joshua and Amber's relatives, who still mourn their children, nor the little boy who was left without parents due to the cruelty of adults, nor all of us who witnessed these terrible events. Many of us are familiar with youthful mistakes and doubts when choosing a life path. Something similar happened to the heroine of today's story, who could not define her own feelings. She was too young to realize how risky love triangles can be. Unfortunately, the girl did not have time to grasp this. Kaye Mundy was only 19 years old, and she was a second-year student at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, USA. She was in a romantic relationship with a 22-year-old man named Mark Houghton. At the same time, Kaye found herself faced with a difficult choice, as in addition to Mark, she continued to maintain a connection with her ex-boyfriend Jet Bertram. Kaye had previously dated him, and even after meeting Mark, she wavered between these two young men for a long time. You can't even imagine how fatal this reckless love triangle turned out to be for her. On October 29, 2017, Kaye, along with her boyfriend Mark Houghton, attended the annual music festival in San Antonio. There, the lovers drank alcohol, smoked marijuana, and then mutually decided to make love in the car. After that, the girl unexpectedly passed out. Mark, noticing that she was not breathing, quickly put her in the car and rushed her to the nearest hospital. It seemed nothing unusual, right? But no, my dears, everything turned out to be extremely tragic. If you're interested in learning about this horrific incident, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. This will greatly support me as an author. The doctors made every effort, using various methods and equipment to save Kaye's life. Unfortunately, this was unsuccessful. The doctors were forced to declare the death of the 19-year-old cheerleader Kaye Mundy due to the injuries sustained. And the girl had many injuries, When Kaylee's mother first saw her daughter in the hospital, it even seemed to her that she had been hit by a train or a truck, or that she had fallen from a plane, so mutilated was the girl's body. There was practically no uninjured spot on her. When the victim was brought to the hospital, her condition was extremely serious. The doctors performed artificial respiration at least 7 times, and they managed to start her heart. However, each time after that, it unfortunately stopped. Kaye fell into a deep coma, so initially the doctors connected her to life support systems. The fight for the girl's life lasted 2 days, but eventually it became clear that Kaylee's brain was dead. The doctors had to inform her parents that there was no hope for recovery. For this reason, the decision was made to disconnect the girl from the artificial ventilation system. Unfortunately, this tragic decision was the most difficult thing Kaylee's parents could experience in their lives, but despite this, her relatives insisted that her last wish must be fulfilled. Kaye had always wanted her organs to be donated to save other people's lives in case of such a tragedy. Her mother was constantly in the ward and until the very end did not believe in the reality of what was happening. But unfortunately, it was true. According to the forensic expert's conclusion, the cause of death was a traumatic brain injury. The deceased was found to have a fractured skull and elbow bone, resulting from blows with a blunt object. In addition, the cheerleader's body was so mutilated that her relatives simply refused to believe that a human being could have done such a thing. It rather seemed as though the girl had been in some terrible accident or was killed by a maniac. You know, in my practice I've seen a lot of bloody cases, but looking at the photos from the hospital, my blood just runs cold. Unfortunately, I can't show them to you due to YouTube's policy. This is a very sad case because at the time of the tragedy, Kaye had just turned 19. She was a second-year student at Trinity University, where she studied public relations. Kaye was a bright, popular, and respected girl in the university's female community. She was a cheerleader, easily made friends, was sociable, and naturally fit into any company. People were drawn to her. According to Kaylee's best friend, the girl was interested not only in studying, but also in building her personal life and enjoyed entertainment. Her whole life was ahead of her. Immediately after entering the university, Kaye fell in love with her first boyfriend, Jet Burcham. He became her first and only truly strong feeling that she could not forget. The young people met in their first year. The guy was a talented athlete, and they immediately felt an attraction. The girl called him her dream and was incredibly proud of their relationship. However, in the opinion of the deceased's mother, it was a typical teenage love. The couple occasionally had arguments, and their feelings would flare up and die down with new intensity. By the second year, Kaye was already convinced that Jet shared her plans for the future to get married and have children. But then the girl began to realize that the guy took life too lightly and did not think about the future prospects. When Kaye became aware of this, she decided to move on. It was at this time that the girl met Mark Howden. He did not study at Trinity University, but was visiting friends there. An immediate mutual attraction arose between Kaye and Mark. They got along wonderfully and started dating. But the girl was unable to completely break off contact with Jet. Thus, she effectively found herself in a relationship with 2 guys at the same time. This became her fatal mistake. Moreover, both young men knew about Kaye's affairs. It seemed as though the girl had arranged some kind of competition or race where she intended to choose the better of them. But for obvious reasons, both guys were categorically against Kaye's experiments and tried in every way to get her to make a final choice. But the young people did not have time to resolve this conflict. Literally a month after the second suitor appeared, the girl ended up in the hospital with injuries incompatible with life. He brought her there in his car around 10:30 p.m. on October 29, 2017. While the doctors were fighting for the victim's life, the police were already talking to 22-year-old Mark. For this, they took him to the most secluded place they could find in the hospital, the chapel there. According to Mark, the couple spent the weekend at the music festival in San Antonio, where they drank alcohol and smoked marijuana. The police found out that such a recreation scenario was a common thing for them. Further, as Mark reported, approximately between 5 and 6 p.m. they went for a ride in his Mercedes. During this trip, an argument flared up between the lovers. Kaye confessed that she still had feelings for her ex-boyfriend Jet. Mark apparently tried to convince her to break up with her ex-boyfriend and stop any communication with his company. Eventually, he managed to calm Kaye down, and she agreed to think about his words. Later, Mark continued. The couple stopped at a deserted parking lot near a gas station, where they engaged in intimate relations. According to the guy, their sex was rough. He claimed that he strangled the girl, slapped her in the face, but assured that Kaye liked it. She enjoyed intense sensations. Despite numerous attempts by the police to latch onto the facts stated by Mark, he steadfastly stood his ground, claiming that everything happened by mutual consent. Was it really like that? Unfortunately, it turned out not to be so simple. Events unfolded not according to the usual scenario. As Mark reported, after sex, he and Kaylee talked for about 5 more minutes, and then the girl started complaining of a headache. But the guy did not attach much importance to it, attributing it to an excess of alcohol. When a few seconds later, Kaylee suddenly passed out and started snoring, Mark still did not sound the alarm. He allegedly decided to take the girl to his apartment in Houston because he thought she had just fallen asleep under the influence of fatigue, alcohol, and drugs. At some point, Kaylee stopped snoring and stopped showing any signs of life at all. That's when the young man became worried. Mark tried to feel for a pulse, but it seemed to him that there was none, and he did not notice any breathing. Only after that did the guy rush to the hospital. Mark claimed to be extremely worried, concerned about Kaylee's condition, and hurried to try to save her life. The detectives who began investigating this incident had no doubt that the girl's horrific body condition was the result of a vicious attack. They interrogated Mark several times, but there was nothing to latch onto. The only inconsistency that immediately caught the eye was the indication of where the car was located. At first, Mark reported that he and Kaylee had spent time at a gas station, and then admitted that they had driven to a deserted parking lot behind it. But in general, these details did not compromise him in any way. The guy did not confess to the murder, and there was a lack of concrete evidence against him. So Mark was released without being charged, although of course he remained the prime suspect. After all, no one believed his story. It was obvious that the girl had been brutally abused before her death. The situation changed radically only after 3 months when the full report of the forensic expert arrived. In the opinion of the specialist, Kaylee died as a result of blunt facial and head trauma, so everything that happened was reclassified as intentional murder. On this basis, on February 28, 2018, Mark was arrested and charged with kidnapping, murder, and rape. However, even then, the young man did not admit his guilt, and later he was even released on bail until the start of the trial. It would seem obvious the girl was last with Mark, so he should be held accountable. But the deeper the police delved into the details of the investigation, the more thoroughly they studied the identity of the suspect and the circumstances of the victim's life, the more they revealed a whole tangle of tragic mistakes, fatal coincidences, and misunderstandings that ultimately led Kaylee to the forensic expert's table. Mark's relatives and friends immediately hired a lawyer for him to defend the innocent young man in their opinion. The lawyer was convinced that the young man was being unfairly held accountable. The lawyer believed that the charges were the result of the negligence and bias of the investigation. In his view, Mark was not involved in the assault, and the cause of the girl's injuries could have been an ordinary fall at the music festival or 2 vigorous efforts by doctors during attempts to save her life. The police's work was significantly complicated by the fact that the officers were unable to find anyone who witnessed what happened, despite the fact that everything took place at a crowded concert. The suspect's lawyer insisted that his client could not have committed such a brutal crime because his behavior did not generally correspond to that of a typical murderer. Instead of trying to cover up the evidence and dispose of the body, Mark himself took the victim to the hospital in an attempt to save her. Of course, the defense tried in every way to create as positive an image of their client as possible. Unfortunately, as the prosecution later discovered, an incredibly experienced and influential lawyer was working with the suspect. It was not until December 2019, a full 2 years after the tragedy, that Mark stood trial for the murder of Kaylee. From the prosecution's point of view, on October 29, 2017, the defendant forcibly dragged the student into his car, effectively kidnapping her from the music festival. Then he drove her to a deserted parking lot behind a gas station. It was there that Mark, enraged by the argument and jealousy of the other guy, brutally abused Kaylee, beating her, raping her, until the girl experienced a brain hemorrhage that caused irreversible consequences. When the victim stopped showing any signs of life, the young man became scared and tried to rectify the situation by getting to the hospital. He really hoped that the doctors would be able to save Kaylee. However, in the opinion of the lawyer, this version of the accusation was flawed from beginning to end, starting with the moment of kidnapping and ending with the beatings and rape. The defender appealed to the fact that the prosecution did not have a single direct witness who could confirm the kidnapping, who saw the girl being forcibly placed in the car and taken away from the festival venue. The defense put forward the assumption that the active attempts to save Kaylee's life and the intensive resuscitation measures by the doctors could have been the cause of the bruises and other injuries on her body. It was known that the doctors performed indirect heart massage on the girl at least 7 times before realizing the futility of these efforts. Unfortunately, the only person who could confirm or refute Mark's version was dead, and although the lawyer's version about the infliction of injuries by doctors sounded extremely doubtful, the prosecution had to rule out all unlikely scenarios claimed by the defense. And for this, witnesses were needed who could shed light on at least some part of the events of that tragic evening. First of all, the investigators interviewed the paramedics who were on duty at the ambulance and were the first to start rescuing the student. Their crew was standing in the parking lot near the emergency room, waiting for the next call. Suddenly, a car stopped behind them with a wild screech of tires. The driver, waving his arms in panic, called for help. It was Mark Howerton. He quickly led the paramedics to his car and showed them the unconscious Kaye. Mark begged them to save the girl, who had allegedly stopped breathing. When the doctors looked into the car, their vigilance only grew. Naked Kaye was lying in the car. Her pants and t-shirt were on the floor. The girl showed no signs of life, and her body was covered in bruises. Even on the inside of her thighs, there were characteristic finger imprints. Kaye was barely breathing, and her pulse was faint, so the doctors immediately began resuscitation measures, artificial respiration, indirect heart massage. A detailed examination of the victim was out of the question at the time her life was at stake. These testimonies of the doctors completely refuted Mark's lie that the bruises appeared on Kaye only after she arrived at the hospital, allegedly from 2 intense resuscitation attempts. After all, everyone who saw the girl during her arrival at the hospital unanimously stated that hematomas had already covered her entire body at that time. Moreover, several witnesses drew attention to Mark's strange appearance. His fists, according to those present, were dirty and red, as if the guy had been fighting with someone for a long time before bringing Kaye to the hospital. It later turned out that Mark was quite muscular and athletic, and he took steroids to increase his muscle mass. And this excessive preoccupation with anabolic steroids, according to his acquaintances, began to provoke sudden mood swings, outbursts of aggression, and uncontrolled fits of rage in the young man. Such a steroid effect could explain the brutal assault on Kaye that evening. The girl may have inadvertently provoked her boyfriend's anger with a careless word or gesture. At first, Mark cooperated quite willingly with the investigation, even allowing his car to be inspected without a warrant. In the car, detectives found a gun and drugs. The defense skillfully used these circumstances to the benefit of their client. The lawyer argued that no one guilty of a serious crime would be so openly cooperative with the police. However, the prosecution quickly saw through this cunning move by the suspect. In their opinion, Mark was deliberately pretending to be innocent and assisting the investigation in every way to deflect any suspicion from himself. The police continued to pressure the guy, and eventually it paid off. They managed to find out that Mark had previously shown aggression towards Kaye. A few weeks before the tragedy, one such conflict ended with a police call. At that time, Kaye simply fled from her enraged boyfriend, who nearly beat her in the dorm. When the law enforcement officers arrived in response to the call, they saw that the room was turned upside down, broken furniture, a smashed laptop, scattered belongings, clothes in the trees outside the window. According to neighbors, Mark caused a terrible mess, but Kaye then withdrew her complaint and asked not to disclose the details. Kayle's friends said that after that incident, the couple's relationship seemed to have ended. Kaye did not want to even talk to Mark and ignored his calls. But later, the former lovers reconciled. During the court hearing, the prosecution demonstrated the couple's personal correspondence. The context of the messages made it clear that Mark reacted very painfully to any hints about a possible breakup. For example, in one of the photos, he was holding a gun to his temple and threatening to kill himself if Kaye did not call him. Thus, Kaye found herself drawn into an extremely dangerous and morbid love triangle. The girl did not dare to completely break up with Mark, fearing that he really might commit suicide, and at the same time, she could not give up her feelings for the other guy, her ex-boyfriend Jet. Kaye herself repeatedly confessed to her friends that she was in love with both of them, which made it so difficult for her to make a choice. At the trial, the prosecution argued that on the eve of the tragedy, in October 2017, Kaye finally decided to break this oppressive bond. It was about this that she informed Jet during the festival. The girl wanted to break up with Mark right after the concert, and until then, she stayed close to him to protect herself from possible aggression in a crowded place. However, as soon as the lovers found themselves alone, the jealous Mark, according to the prosecution's version, forcibly dragged the girl into the car and drove her to a deserted place, where he brutally assaulted her. Unfortunately, the key witness in this case was supposed to be Jet Bircham, Kaylee's other boyfriend. And indeed, during the first court hearing, it was thanks to his testimony that the prosecution had grounds to accuse Mark of kidnapping, rape, and murder. But very quickly, the defense managed to discredit Jet's testimony. As it turned out, he was not actually an eyewitness to the kidnapping. Jet did not see firsthand how Mark forcibly put Kaylee in his car, although he initially claimed that he had personally witnessed this. This all came to light when the lawyer started cornering the guy, asking him why he did not rush to the girl's aid if he had witnessed the violence. In reality, Kaylee and Mark had disappeared from Jet's sight even before that moment. He could not have witnessed their departure, and he was relaying second-hand information, although he was unable to name those people. All of this gave the defense grounds to accuse Jet of false testimony and dealt a devastating blow to the prosecution's case. Their main witness now looked extremely unreliable, which undermined confidence in his words. In addition, during the trial, photos of drugs, suspicious contacts, and correspondence were found on Jet Bircham's mobile phone. This gave grounds to suspect the guy of drug abuse and involvement in drug distribution. It later turned out that at the time of Kaylee's death, her ex-boyfriend was on probation. He had previously been arrested for selling marijuana, and among the youth of San Antonio, Jet had a reputation as a well-known dealer. The defense conducted a harsh cross-examination, and at some point, Bircham began to evade answering questions, citing his constitutional rights. For a guy who had cooperated with law enforcement and received immunity from criminal prosecution in exchange for his testimony, such behavior seemed extremely strange. It seemed as though he was afraid of exposing himself in some dubious dealings that were unrelated to Kaylee's case. Additionally, Mark's lawyer managed to find out that Jet had previous legal problems. Shortly before the incident with Kaylee, he had been expelled from the university for harassing another student who had filed a police report. At that time, Jet was able to settle the conflict by promising to voluntarily leave the educational institution, so the defense openly pressured the jurors, portraying Jet as a real scoundrel, a drug dealer, harasser, and liar. Who would believe such a witness? But the prosecution did not give up. In order to dispel any doubts about the causes of Kaylee's death, the prosecution brought in several independent experts. The forensic experts came to an unambiguous conclusion: the head trauma that caused the massive brain hemorrhage and ultimately the girl's death could in no way have been sustained as a result of her short stay in the hospital, as the defense had insisted. The lawyer's version that Kaylee had allegedly fallen and hit her head after being hospitalized sounded completely absurd. The girl had lost consciousness even before arriving at the clinic, so all the efforts of the doctors were aimed precisely at trying to revive her. So it was highly unlikely that they would have allowed someone to strike the patient so hard that she sustained a fatal traumatic brain injury. However, several experts brought in by the defense suggested that some of the bruises on the victim's body could have appeared as a result of her preparation for organ donation, a procedure that Kaylee herself had insisted on while still alive. Based on data about the nature and location of the injuries, forensic experts used 3D modeling to recreate the circumstances of the attack on the girl. These materials clearly demonstrated to the jurors that Kaylee's death was undoubtedly the result of a brutal beating, not an accident or medical negligence. The results of the toxicological examination were also a significant argument for the prosecution. The analysis of Kaylee's blood showed a high content of psychoactive substances that increased blood pressure and, consequently, the risk of internal bleeding and rupture of blood vessels. Therefore, Mark's defenders appealed to this fact, saying that with such a cocktail in the body, even a minor head injury could have provoked a fatal brain hemorrhage, which is what happened to the girl. However, the prosecution insisted that this was a case of intentional murder. After all, neither an accidental fall nor a medical error could explain the broken nose, split lip, bruises on the neck, and other characteristic injuries that eloquently testified to the girl's brutal beating. Eventually, after intense and lengthy debates between the parties, the jurors retired to the deliberation room to render a verdict. Just a few hours later, the defense received a shocking phone call. An unexpected witness contacted the lawyer, claiming that he had seen Kaylee's condition during her hospitalization. It was a duty nurse from the emergency room where the girl ended up. He assured them that when Kaylee was first brought in, there were no bruises on her body. In his opinion, that the hematomas could have arisen from internal bleeding due to prolonged cardiac arrests and measures taken to prepare the body for organ removal. Such testimony could have completely cleared Mark Houghton of the charges, but as the judge explained to the lawyer at this stage, it was no longer possible to involve new witnesses. The jury's deliberations lasted more than 10 hours. For 2 days, they were unable to reach a consensus. The court was unable to satisfy the thirst for justice of the deceased girl's relatives. The jurors proved unable to render a unanimous verdict regarding the defendant's guilt. As a result, the court was forced to declare the previous trial improper and schedule a retrial. Despite this interim result, both sides stated that they were ready to continue defending their positions. The defense planned to seek a complete review of the case, including due to Jet Bertram's dishonest testimony and the appearance of a new witness. As for Kaye Mundy's parents, despite everything, they had no doubts about Mark's guilt. They were determined to continue seeking to hold their daughter's abuser accountable, and very soon their hopes were fulfilled. The prosecution refiled charges against Mark Houghton. In June 2023, a new trial began. This time, it was held behind closed doors without access for the press or outsiders. So many details remained unknown to the general public. Initially, in 2018, the young man faced life in prison. But during the retrial, the qualification of the crime and the measure of punishment were somewhat mitigated. Now Mark was charged with assault under aggravating circumstances, which carried a sentence of up to 20 years in prison. At this stage, the prosecution brought in a new expert, a specialist in domestic violence. He vividly depicted Mark's psychological portrait to the jurors as a classic abuser, a jealous owner who sought by any means to cut off Kaye from all contact with the outside world, intimidated her, humiliated her, threatened her, and eventually could not restrain himself and crippled the girl in a fit of rage. In the expert's opinion, the 19-year-old Kaye, due to her young age and inexperience, simply did not realize who she was dealing with and what danger she was in. As in the previous trial, a heated discussion about the nature of Kaye's injuries unfolded in the courtroom. The defense was still unable to involve the new witness in the case, that same nurse who allegedly saw the girl's condition before the bruises appeared. Therefore, the prosecution's version turned out to be more convincing. Eventually, despite all the objections and attempts to play on the jurors' sympathies, Mark lost. He was found guilty and sentenced to the maximum term of 20 years in prison. Such is the sad and instructive story of Kaye Mundy. A very young, inexperienced girl, blinded by love, failed to notice that her chosen one was a dangerous and unpredictable type. The one who swore to love and protect her turned out to be a real monster, and it cost Kaye her life. Let this tragedy serve as a warning to all of us. Be cautious and careful in relationships. Do not ignore warning signs. Remember, if someone truly loves you, they will never express their feelings through rudeness, control, threats, or blackmail. These are signs of an unhealthy relationship that you need to get out of immediately. Unfortunately, Kaye and her relatives did not attach importance to these red flags. The girl believed that she could tame her chosen one's evil temper and appealed to his common sense. But someone who is used to pressuring and intimidating rarely stops on their own. That is why victims of violence should seek help as soon as possible. Nowadays, in the USA, as in many other countries, there is an entire system to protect and support victims of domestic abuse. Crisis centers, hotlines, community organizations operate. The police, courts, and social services are all called upon to protect the vulnerable and prevent such tragedies. The central coast of New South Wales in Australia conceals a place with a grim reputation. Snapper Point, also known as the Deadly Cliffs. Despite being a popular tourist attraction, especially among fishing enthusiasts, this location is notorious for its steep, jagged cliffs. It's not uncommon for people to fall from these slopes straight into the turbulent ocean or get swept away by sudden waves. In recent years, at least 16 tourists have lost their lives in this area. However, as practice shows, it's not always just a blind chance or the whims of nature that cause these deaths. This story is about one such case. On April 24, 2016, around 10:30 in the morning, several visiting fishermen were going about their business near Snapper Point. Suddenly, some of them, looking down from the cliffs, noticed a strange object beating against the waves. It quickly became clear that it was a body wrapped in black plastic, another victim of the treacherous Deadly Cliffs. One of the witnesses immediately reported the gruesome find to the police. Soon, a rescue helicopter arrived at the scene to retrieve the body, which was lying face down. But from the first glance, the specialist realized that this was no mere accident. The discovered body belonged to a young girl and had over 30 stab wounds. Particularly deep blows were inflicted on the neck, and there were traces on the hands and wrists indicating desperate attempts to defend herself. Unfortunately, the victim's clothing was never found. which significantly complicated the process of identifying her. The primary task for the police was to establish the identity of the deceased, and only then reconstruct the chain of events that led the girl to the medical examiner's table. But recognizing her proved to be difficult. There were no distinctive features or characteristic details of appearance. The expert determined that death occurred as a result of a brutal stabbing, and the defensive wounds on the hands indicated that the girl fought for her life until the very end. The fact that the body was found naked suggested a probable rape, but it was impossible to confirm or refute this version. The water washed away all potential evidence. To help identify the victim, law enforcement officers created a computer reconstruction of her appearance and published it online, dubbing the deceased Snapper Point Jane Doe. The girl had Asian facial features, looked to be 20 to 35 years old, was of average build, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, with dark chestnut shoulder-length hair. The condition of the body suggested that it had been in the water for a relatively short time. Questioning fishermen and other potential witnesses yielded no results. No one saw anyone throw a dead girl from the cliffs into the water. The police began a large-scale check of all recently missing persons in the region, both local residents and tourists. Special attention was paid to those who might have lost contact with loved ones, friends, or girlfriends. At the same time, an active search was underway among foreigners who had recently arrived in Australia. And so, quite quickly, people responded who noticed a striking resemblance between the mysterious victim and a Chinese student who had come to Australia on an exchange 4 years ago. They immediately reported this to the police. The very next Friday after the body was discovered, the detectives working on the case were able to establish the identity of the deceased. She turned out to be 25-year-old Michelle Lamb, who had gone missing at the time of her death. As it turned out, Michelle lived in the suburb of Campsie, in Sydney, about 100 kilometers from the place where her mutilated body was found. And here's a chilling coincidence. Just a year before her death, the girl took a photo on the very cliff from which her dead body was later thrown. In the picture, Michelle posed against the backdrop of water and cliffs, as if anticipating her own fate. When the media picked up this news, rumors began to spread that the girl had come to this place to meet a guy she had met online, and this date turned out to be fatal for her. Journalists spun the version that an unknown suitor literally lured Michelle to her death, but the police promptly worked out this version and refuted it. A detailed analysis of the girl's correspondence and messengers showed that she did not meet anyone and did not plan any meetings. So who and why did someone need to cut short the life of a young student? To answer this question, investigators had to delve deeper into the details of Michelle's life and surroundings. The nature of the crime, extreme brutality, and a large number of stab wounds indicated a personal motive. The police did not abandon hope of finding the killer's trail. It was established that Michelle Lamb was born in China in 1991 and had been very close to her mother, Mei Jiang, all her life. Michelle Lamb's life path was full of trials from a young age. A heavy blow to the family was the death of the girl's father during a devastating earthquake that occurred in her hometown in China. This tragedy not only took the life of the closest person, but also put the family in a difficult financial situation. However, despite all the hardships, mother and daughter became even more united in the face of difficulties. Their relationship became stronger, and their emotional bond became unbreakable. Michelle acutely felt responsible for the fate of her mother and understood that without her support, they were unlikely to survive. It was then, in search of a better life and opportunities to help her family, that the girl made the decision to radically change her life. She began to consider options for moving to another country, where she could find a promising job and get a quality education. And her choice fell on distant Australia. In 2011, full of hope and expectations, Michelle Lamb arrived in Sydney, the largest city on the green continent. The girl was sure that it was here, in this metropolis of opportunities, that she would be able to realize her dreams and ambitions. And at first, it seemed that fate was smiling upon her. Michelle adapted to the new realities fairly quickly, made new friends, and settled her life. She became a student at the University of Technology, Sydney, choosing economics and business as her specialty. In parallel with her studies, the girl found a job in order to be able to financially support her mother. It is worth noting that Michelle, without hesitation, sent her first salary to her mother in China. And from then on, every month she transferred money to her family, because deep in her heart, she understood how important her help was for them. In Australia, Michelle was lucky with housing. She did not have to rent an apartment, because her relatives themselves suggested that the girl should live with them in an apartment complex in the Sydney suburb of Campsie. There she lived with her 48-year-old aunt, her teenage son from a previous marriage, and her 28-year-old uncle, Derek Barrett, who was Michelle's second cousin and had been married to her aunt since 2012. For the girl's mother, this arrangement was a great relief because she knew that her daughter was under the supervision of relatives. This gave her peace of mind and confidence that nothing bad would happen to Michelle. And the girl herself enjoyed the company of close relatives. She had a warm, trusting relationship with her aunt and uncle. They seemed to Michelle to be decent, reliable people with whom one could not only share a roof over their heads, but also share the most intimate things. In addition, living with family allowed the girl to send more money to her mother, because it was possible to significantly save on housing rent. To better understand what kind of person Michelle was, investigators thoroughly studied her social media pages. There they searched for the smallest details, seemingly insignificant facts that could shed light on the identity of the deceased and, most importantly, lead to the trail of the killer. Law enforcement officers scrupulously analyzed the girl's posts, comments, likes, and photos. They checked recent calls and messages to understand who Michelle had been communicating with recently, what plans and intentions she had. This work was painstaking but extremely necessary. From the profiles on social networks, a picture emerged of a happy life of a young girl, filled with bright moments. Michelle often shared positive emotions and life-affirming thoughts with friends, loved to philosophize on topics that excited her soul. Among the publications, there were many selfies with friends against the backdrop of picturesque Australian landscapes. A special place was occupied by culinary masterpieces, which Michelle loved to show off so much. The girl adored cooking and sharing the results of her efforts on the web. It seemed that Michelle lived a tasty life in every sense of the word. Together with her friends, she often visited cafes and restaurants, tried new dishes, and studied the intricacies of local cuisine. Another passion of hers was animals, nature, and beaches. Photos from the picturesque corners of Australia appeared on the girl's pages from time to time. However, despite the richness of the newsfeed, the detectives could not find any hint of any suspicious acquaintances or dangerous connections. Then the investigators decided to talk to Michelle's closest circle, her friends and housemates. From them, it became known that the girl last got in touch on April 21st, 2016. Then she told her friends that she was planning a trip to the mall for shopping. Around noon, Michelle got on a train and went about her business. Later, the police obtained footage from surveillance cameras at the shopping center. They clearly showed the girl strolling between the rows of stores, trying things on, and buying new clothes in different departments. Her entire route through the mall was traced in detail, up to the moment when Michelle boarded the return train to Campsie. But what happened to the girl next remained a mystery. After all, there were no cameras along the way from the station to the house where Michelle lived. The last clue was that the girl logged into her media platform one more time after returning, but then her online activity stopped. Most likely, it was at that moment that something terrible happened to her. It was also strange that Michelle disappeared on Thursday, and already on Sunday, her mutilated body was found tens of kilometers from home, on the cliffs at Snapper Point. And the first to fall under suspicion were her housemates, her aunt with her husband and their son. The woman confessed to the police that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was in another city on business, so she did not even know whether Michelle had returned from shopping. But her husband, the deceased's uncle Derek Barrett, allegedly spent the whole evening at home. According to him, they had dinner together and then he went to bed. When he woke up in the morning, Michelle was already gone. The man assumed that his niece, like many girls her age, was having fun somewhere with friends, maybe even stayed overnight with someone. So at first, no one attached much importance to this. But when the girl did not show up at home on Saturday, Derek became worried. He began to write messages to Michelle, but in response, silence. The girl's mother, who was used to communicating with her daughter every day, was no less worried. Usually they talked a lot on the phone, but this time, Michelle seemed to have vanished into thin air. The aunt, returning home on Sunday, decided to look into her niece's room, and two things alerted her. Firstly, all of Michelle's things were in their places. It seemed that the girl was not going to go anywhere for a long time. And secondly, perfect cleanliness reigned in the room, as if Michelle had put things in order before something. And this was also very strange. The aunt and uncle, shocked by the suspicious circumstances of Michelle's disappearance, decided to contact the police. Their statement was received almost simultaneously with the message from the girl's friends, who actively disseminated information about her disappearance on the web. Thanks to Michelle's wide circle of acquaintances, the news of her disappearance spread like lightning across the internet and became public knowledge. The publication on the Chinese website Weibo turned out to be especially resonant. It helped to link the unidentified body found on the cliffs with the missing student. Detectives, having processed all available information about Michelle, came to the conclusion that the girl had no obvious ill-wishers. In addition, she was quite smart and savvy to stand up for herself if necessary. Cheerful and sociable, Michelle was unlikely to become a victim of a targeted murder. So the police suggested that it could have been an attack by some maniac operating in the area. However, no other similar crimes were recorded in the area. While Michelle's killer was freely roaming at large, the public was increasingly worried about their own safety and expressed dissatisfaction with the actions of law enforcement officers. It seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end. Considering all possible versions, the investigators did not rule out racist motives. After all, the victim was an Asian girl. All students of the appropriate origin were warned about the potential danger. Until the criminal was at large, none of them could feel safe. Society demanded that the police solve the murder and arrest the suspect as soon as possible. Michelle's grief-stricken mother arrived in Australia to meet with the relatives with whom her daughter lived until her death. The woman gave several interviews to the press in which she promised to make every effort to find the dangerous criminal. She was full of determination and put a lot of pressure on the police. From her, journalists learned that Michelle's grandmother could not withstand the news of her granddaughter's death and died of a heart attack. Thus, the killer took the lives of two family members at once. First of all, the investigators thoroughly checked the alibis of Michelle's closest circle. Her aunt had reliable confirmation that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was on a business trip in a small town south of Sydney. This was evidenced by several witnesses, as well as tickets for transport and surveillance camera recordings. The woman herself was very hard going through the tragedy, blaming herself for not protecting Michelle. In her opinion, if she had not left home on that ill-fated day, then perhaps she could have prevented the disaster and saved her niece's life. The deceased's cousin, who lived with Michelle, her aunt, and his stepfather, also had an alibi. On the day of the girl's disappearance, he was engaged in everyday affairs, went to school, met with friends. Unlike Uncle Derek, the boy admitted that he did not see his sister on Thursday. Derek himself claimed that he spent the whole day at the computer. Being an IT specialist, the man supposedly worked hard on urgent projects that he had to complete by Monday. Michelle's cousin confirmed that his uncle really did not leave the computer then, but the boy could vouch for only about 3 hours spent with Derek in the apartment. Subsequently, the teenager made a shocking confession to the investigation. In general, neither Derek nor his stepson had a reliable alibi, so the police bombarded them with questions. After the first interrogation, Derek suddenly changed his testimony. It turned out that in fact, he left the house and met with some girl while his wife was away. This detail immediately attracted the attention of investigators. When asked why he did not tell about this immediately, the man referred to problems with drug addiction. Allegedly, due to the use of psychotropic substances, He has memory lapses, so he remembers the events of that day very vaguely. Such a confession sharply contrasted with the previous image of a decent family man that Derek was trying to create, and he could not provide the contacts of the girl with whom he allegedly met, so no one believed this version. Then Derek changed his testimony again. Now he stated that he was simply afraid to admit to cheating so as not to lose his wife if she found out about everything. This story seemed extremely dubious to the detectives. In addition, they noticed discrepancies in the testimony of Derek and his stepson, so the investigators' suspicions focused on the figure of Michelle's stepfather. To shed light on this dark story, the police decided to find out more about Derek Barrett and study the information from his mobile phone. By tracking the geolocation, law enforcement officers found that literally half an hour before the discovery of Michelle's body, the suspect's phone lit up 10 kilometers from Snapper Point. After reviewing the footage from surveillance cameras, investigators recorded how Derek refueled his car at a gas station near the crime scene. There, he also bought some drinks, paying with a bank card. The surveillance camera footage at the gas station clearly captured Derek Barrett, leaving no doubt about his presence in the area. So the detectives decided to ask what the suspect was doing so close to where Michelle's body was found shortly before its discovery. The man explained his presence at Snapper Point by visiting relatives. As it later turned out, Derek knew these places very well, as he was born and raised nearby. Moreover, a year ago, it was he who took Michelle to Snapper Point, where the girl even managed to take several photos against the backdrop of picturesque cliffs. However, such a coincidence seemed extremely dubious to the investigators. Although they understood that it would not be easy to prove Derek's involvement in the crime. However, intuition persistently suggested to the cops that it was worth digging deeper in the direction of Barrett. So they obtained permission for a more detailed study of the contents of his mobile phone, hoping to find at least some clues that would link the suspect with the victim. And their efforts were not in vain. Thanks to special programs, experts were able to restore a lot of deleted photos and videos that shocked seasoned police officers. In many frames, Michelle was completely naked and, it seems, did not even suspect that she was being filmed secretly. The girl carelessly slept or took a shower while Derek voyeuristically recorded her on camera. But the most chilling discovery were the clips in which the unfortunate Michelle lay on the bed tied up, with a gag in her mouth. Her gaze, full of despair and pleas for salvation, left no doubt. The girl became a victim of brutal violence against her will. This evidence from Derek's phone actually confirmed his guilt in the death of his niece. The collected materials were more than enough to consider Barrett not just the main suspect, but actually Michelle's killer. So on April 30th, Derek was arrested and taken into custody. However, the man immediately began to deny any involvement in the crime. The defendant's lawyer petitioned for his client's release on bail, but the defense's argument sounded unconvincing. Derek himself, through his attorney, expressed genuine surprise at the suspicions and arrest. Despite this, his wife, the aunt of the deceased Michelle, immediately filed for divorce. The woman was stunned by what had been happening within the walls of her house right under her nose. How could she have failed to notice all these warning signs earlier? She and her son immediately cut off all relations with Derek. Investigators determined that the photos of Michelle bound and gagged were taken on the day of her disappearance. Thus, the girl simply had no chance to tell anyone about the violence she had endured. Derek had personally documented his horrific crime against his defenseless niece on his phone. Earlier recordings were also found where he abused Michelle in a somewhat milder form. The girl probably did not realize the full danger, which is why she remained silent about her uncle's perversions. The collected evidence allowed investigators to reconstruct the picture of what happened on that fateful day of April 21st, 2016. When Michelle returned home, Derek snuck into her room and forcibly made her undress. Then he tied the girl up and gagged her. Recording all of this on camera, the pervert at his victim. Soon after, Michelle's cousin, her aunt's son, returned home. The boy reported that for almost the entire time he was in the apartment, he did not see his stepfather but only heard some sounds. Apparently, water was constantly running in the shower, and Derek wasn't coming out for some reason. This seemed suspicious to the teenager, so he even became a bit worried. He approached the bathroom door and asked his stepfather if everything was all right. Hearing an affirmative response, the boy calmed down somewhat. Still, it was strange that Derek had been in the shower for almost 3 hours straight. During all this time, the man only opened the door once to ask his stepson to hand him some shampoo he had supposedly forgotten in the room. At the same time, Derek did not allow the boy to enter. Michelle's cousin sensed something was wrong but didn't dare to argue with his stepfather. At that moment, the teenager had no idea that he had narrowly missed witnessing the violence and that he could have saved his sister if he had insisted. The boy had no idea that Michelle was at home all this time. After all, judging by everything, she was tied up in her room upstairs. Shortly after her cousin left for a walk with friends, the unfortunate girl met her death at the hands of the perverted sadist. Derek managed to conceal the exact course of events and circumstances of the murder. The man claimed that due to drug use, he suffered from amnesia, so he simply didn't remember the details. It is only known that after the killing, Michelle's body ended up in the trunk of Derek's car. On April 23rd, the day after the murder, surveillance cameras on a neighboring house recorded the suspect taking out the trash from his home 4 times. Most likely, this was Derek's attempt to get rid of blood traces in the room. Then the man took the body to Sniper Point, the place where Michelle's mutilated remains were later discovered. Recordings from other surveillance cameras confirm that around 7 in the morning on April 24th, Derek's car entered the territory of Lake Manmura National Park. Just a few hours later, the girl's body was found by fishermen at the foot of the cliffs. The collected evidence was quite sufficient to prove Derek Barrett's guilt. The only chance for the defendant to avoid responsibility could have been declaring him insane. This is what the man's defense insisted on, using his claimed amnesia as an argument. However, the conclusions of the psychiatric examination were disappointing for Derek. The doctors did not find any deviations or disorders in him that could have affected his awareness of his own actions. This meant that the man was fully capable of standing trial and answering for his actions. So, after consulting with his lawyer, Derek Barrett decided to plead guilty to all charges, hoping to mitigate his sentence this way. During the trial, he tearfully apologized several times to those present, especially to his victim's mother. However, even in the dock, Derek continued to insist that drug problems had led to lapses in his memory. During the court hearing, Derek Barrett repeatedly stated that the events of that fateful day were forever etched in his memory, not allowing him to sleep peacefully at night. The man claimed that he was tormented by nightmares from which he would wake up in tears. The accused even expressed remorse for his actions, assuring that he sincerely regretted the consequences of his deeds. However, Derek continued to insist that on the day of the murder, he was under the strong influence of narcotics, which caused him to be unaware of his actions and unable to recall the details of what had happened. While in prison, he even wrote a letter to his victim's mother, May, in which he begged for forgiveness. In his message, Derek apologized 1,000 times for what he had done, assuring that he deeply regretted the crime committed. But despite all his pleas, the court found Barrett guilty of first-degree murder and a whole series of other serious crimes. The incredible cruelty and perverted nature of the sexual violence Michelle endured became aggravating circumstances in the sentencing. Consequently, Derek was sentenced to 46 years in prison. According to Australian law, he will have the right to apply for parole after serving 34 years of this term. However, the story of Michelle Leng's suffering did not end there. In 2019, a fateful event occurred that shed light on the full scale of abuse the 25-year-old student from China endured before her horrific death. It happened when Michelle's aunt came to visit her elderly mother, who lived in Strathfield, another Sydney suburb. The girl's grandmother suffered from dementia, so her daughter had to visit the sick woman often. During one of these visits, the elderly lady was tightly clutching a small object in her hands. When her daughter asked to see what she had, the woman handed her a USB flash drive. Michelle's mother wondered what it was and what information it contained. Unfortunately, the grandmother couldn't answer these questions. She thought she was holding some kind of toy, so Michelle's aunt took the flash drive with her. Upon arriving home, the woman decided out of curiosity to see what might be on it. She inserted the drive into her computer and froze in horror at seeing its contents. The aunt immediately contacted the police, handing over the terrible find to law enforcement. The flash drive contained 13 photographs and 9 videos, with a total duration of over an hour. All these materials vividly demonstrated the horrific scale of abuse that poor Michelle endured in the last hours of her life. The video showed Derek bursting into the girl's room, brutally tossing her around like a rag doll, after which he repeatedly raped her. Michelle's screams and pleas to stop the abuse seemed only to fuel her executioner's sadistic inclinations. Derek's face was frozen in a mask of perverted pleasure, and it didn't look at all like the man was under the influence of drugs, as he tried to prove in court. No, it seemed he was simply reveling in his power over the defenseless victim and deriving sick satisfaction from the very process of violence. But it still remains a mystery how the flash drive with these horrifying video evidence ended up with Michelle's grandmother. The old woman had no connection to either Derek or his victim. She lived quite far from Campsie, and she couldn't explain the origin of the USB drive herself due to progressive dementia. Eventually, the court was forced to review the charges against Derek Barrett in light of the newly discovered circumstances. He was charged with 9 additional counts related to sex crimes. This increased his prison term by 20 years, to 66, and the period after which Barrett can apply for parole increased to 36.5 years. The relatives of the deceased girl insisted that her killer should be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In their opinion, the terrible cruelty and perverted nature of the crime against poor Michelle could not have any other verdict. The judge took into account the appeal of the victim's loved ones, but noted that from a legal standpoint, life imprisonment was not possible in this case. So Derek Barrett will have the right to file his first petition for parole no earlier than 2052. But even this term seems too merciful, given the suffering that Michelle and her loved ones endured at his hands. After all, the girl came from her home to distant Australia not to become prey to a pervert who turned out to be a real wolf in sheep's clothing. Michelle was simply trying to help her mother and ease the financial burden on her family by agreeing to live with relatives and save on rent. The unfortunate victim silently endured abuse for 4 long years, hoping that one day it would finally stop. Unfortunately, instead of rescue, she was met with a tragic and premature death at the hands of her sadistic uncle. The tragic story of Michelle Lang is a bitter lesson for all of us. It reminds us how important it is to be vigilant and careful, even when it seems there is no danger. For sometimes evil hides where we least expect to see it. First and foremost, this story underscores the importance of open dialogue in the family. If Michelle had felt she could safely tell someone about what was happening, perhaps the tragedy could have been avoided. So creating an atmosphere of trust and mutual understanding between loved ones is the first step to preventing such situations. Also, this terrible story teaches us not to ignore warning signs. Perhaps if Michelle's relatives had been more attentive to changes in her behavior, they could have raised the alarm in time. So if you notice that something incomprehensible is happening with your loved ones, don't be afraid to reveal it and offer your help. Women and girls should be especially careful. Unfortunately, they most often become victims of domestic violence and perverted encroachments. So it's so important not to be silent, not to be ashamed, and not to endure abuse. If you feel something is wrong, immediately seek protection from relatives or contact law enforcement. Let Michelle's death not be in vain. Let's make her story a warning to all of us. Let's be more sensitive to our loved ones, more attentive to alarming bells, and always ready to come to the aid of those who need it. Meet the Dwayne twins, Alison and Ann. The women were born in Utica, New York. In 1978, they also had an older sister named Amy who was 3 years their senior. When the twin girls were 5 years old, their mother Miriam passed away, leaving them to grow up without maternal love and care. The girls were twins, almost identical in facial features and personalities, but there were differences between them. Alison had a more dominant personality and was a leader, while Anne, unlike her sister, was more reserved, balanced, sweet and kind. Like all twins, the girls did everything together, were inseparable, and sometimes it seemed abnormal how well they could sense each other, as if they had telepathy between them. They could understand what the other needed at any moment, or what the other was about to say before she said it. They were very close and loved each other dearly, but at the same time, there was a kind of toxic, perverse relationship between them, bordering on hatred. Those who knew the twins were amazed at how they could sense each other. If one started to speak, the other could finish her sister's sentences, but throughout their lives, the sisters would fight each other like crazy. Their lives were full of ups and downs, quarrels and terrible fights, then moments of love, and then it would all repeat. Of course, the absence of their mother left an imprint on them, but time passed, the sisters grew up, and in their teens, the girls became interested in yoga, which should have had a beneficial effect on the twins, calming them down and stopping their fights. Indeed, externally, everything seemed quite peaceful. The twins' fascination with yoga led them to the idea of starting their career by opening a joint yoga studio. They found a suitable place around Palm Beach, Florida, invested money, and in 2008 they opened a studio for those who wanted to practice yoga, called Double Power Yoga. This studio opened in 2008, existed for a fairly long period until 2014. The studio immediately became popular. Within 2 months, the yoga school had gained fame in the city, attracting a large number of people who wanted to practice, and the sisters became recognizable personalities, making acquaintances with influential people. The twins' business brought in a good income, and over time the sisters bought identical Porsche cars, which they drove around the city. The girls started living in an elite high-rise building in Palm Beach, dressing in fashionable salons, and continued to spread the idea of practicing yoga, telling everyone how much yoga can help in life. The sisters said that their yoga studio in Palm Beach was the heartbeat of the entire area. The yoga school was thriving, but behind the scenes, where outsiders couldn't see, the relationship between the sisters remained the same as in childhood. They quarreled and fought like teenage girls. As the twins' yoga studio was gaining popularity, they were approached with an offer to star in a reality show that would be about the studio run by twins, as well as about all the dramas in their lives. But for some reason, the release of this project stalled, but the producers, convincing the sisters that the show would definitely be released and that it would be necessary to show the sisters' success, persuaded the girls to rent a more beautiful and spacious premises for yoga classes, and the sisters followed this advice. Despite the fact that the show never materialized, the twins moved to a studio that was more pleasant for them, but the maintenance costs increased and they could no longer fully cover them. Getting a good fee for participating in the show didn't work out for the sisters, and the bills were huge. They gradually began to get into debt, which further aggravated the situation, and in 2014 it was decided to close the studio. The sisters closed the studio in a very peculiar way. They just left. The sisters just abandoned the classes, didn't show up at the studio, didn't pay the employees, didn't return people's money for their participation. And this angered society and turned it against the sisters, because those who came to practice at the studio felt simply robbed. Therefore, the twin sisters left the city and moved to Utah Park City, Utah, and also changed their names, as they planned to write a book in the future, and their names were too well known and frequently appeared on the internet. Because of the failure with the yoga studio, the sisters wanted to start from scratch. Alison changed her name to Alexandria, and Anne became Anastasia. Having settled in a new place, the girls opened another yoga studio, but they no longer had the same success as the first time. Their studio failed, and as a result, the twins found themselves in debt for $150,000 and became bankrupt. At the same time, the relocation, debts, and bankruptcy were accompanied by stress and worries, and the twins began to quarrel more than usual, and to relieve stress, they began to resort to alcohol more often. According to eyewitnesses, while the girls lived in Utah Park City, neighbors repeatedly called the police on them because the sisters drank a lot, loudly argued, and fought. Apparently, the twins were going through very difficult times during this period, were depressed, experiencing depression, and they didn't like living in Utah, so in the end, they packed all their things and went to the most beautiful place on earth, Hawaii. This was in 2015, and interestingly, when the twins said they were going to Hawaii, they added that they were going on a real pilgrimage, ride through holy places, and want to search for the meaning of life. But as soon as the sisters reached their destination, they again faced problems and got into trouble. One time, or rather on Christmas Eve, Alexandria and Anastasia decided to celebrate Christmas in a fun way. As usual, they didn't know when to stop with alcohol. The feast took place in a restaurant where the girls got pretty drunk and, of course, quarreled. Having decided to go home, they, however, did not stop arguing and already near the car began to swear so fiercely that they lost control and drove into a ditch. This happened very close to the restaurant, and the consequences could have been very serious. Fortunately, when the police arrived at the scene, the sisters had already gotten out of the car safe and sound. However, instead of calming down, they continued to swear and even began to insult the restaurant owner. Not understanding what was happening and why they were so angry with him, the sisters, in their drunken frenzy, even threatened him with violence, saying, "We will send the mafia to you. Let them deal with you." Of course, such behavior did not go unnoticed. The police detained the belligerent sisters for hooliganism. As a result, a fine, and it seems a certain sobering up, because after this incident they seemed to calm down a little. Further events showed that pleasant changes also took place in the life of the twins. In 2016, they both found boyfriends and started dating guys. For Alexandria, it was Lonnie Dickerson, and Anastasia started a relationship with Federico Bailey. It would seem that personal life was getting better and the sisters finally found their happiness. But not everything was so cloudless. Once Federico and Anastasia decided to go on a hike. Alexandria was supposed to stay at home. While preparing for the trip and stocking up on groceries at the supermarket, Anastasia accidentally took her sister's credit card instead of her own. Deciding not to use someone else's card, she went back home to get her own. But suddenly Alexandria for some reason changed her mind and decided that she also wanted to join the hike. It is worth noting that Federico, unlike the sisters, perfectly understood the problems associated with alcohol and tried to protect the girls from unnecessary temptation. Therefore, during this trip, he strictly forbade taking any alcoholic beverages with them. But Alexandria, as always, did her own thing. She secretly took a bottle of wine with her and hid it well in the car. When Federico discovered the forbidden alcohol, he was very upset and disappointed. This find caused considerable tension between the participants of the hike. Anastasia, in turn, got angry with her sister for such an irresponsible act. As we can see, even on vacation, in the company of their loved ones, the sisters could not get rid of their old habits and again found themselves in the epicenter of conflict. It would seem that a bottle of wine is a trifle, but it is from such trifles that serious problems often begin. And something tells me that this incident was just the tip of the iceberg. What other surprises did the Dwayne sisters have in store for their companions during this trip? I will note that after that tense scene with the wine, the company, which consisted of sisters Alexandria and Anastasia, as well as Anastasia's boyfriend Federico, finally reached their destination. The campsite where they stopped was located in a surprisingly picturesque area, surrounded by wonderful views of wildlife. While the girls were unpacking their things, Federico decided to freshen up after the long road and went to the nearest spring. However, when he returned to the camp, he was surprised to find that neither the sisters nor their car were anywhere to be seen. It's hard to even imagine what he felt at that moment: confusion, anxiety, perhaps even fear for his companions. As it later turned out, while Federico was away, Alexandria and Anastasia for some reason decided to get in the car and drive down the road that led to Hana. This highway, by the way, is considered one of the most beautiful in the world, but at the same time one of the most dangerous. It winds between the rocks, sometimes resembling a serpentine more than a road. On one side is a solid stone wall, on the other is an abyss that takes your breath away just by looking at it. In addition, the sharp turns on this road often do not allow you to see if someone is approaching from the opposite direction. And if we add to this the fact that the route is not always well maintained and there are potholes, it becomes clear that traveling on it is a real challenge for the driver. But it seems that the Dwayne sisters were little concerned about all these dangers. They boldly, if not carelessly, raced along the winding road, paying no attention to either the beauty around them or the risks that lurked at every turn. And all this because they were preoccupied with another argument. It's hard to even imagine what they could argue about at such a crucial moment, because it's obvious that on this road you need to be as attentive and careful as possible. But despite everything, the sisters managed to notice a lonely woman on the side of the road who obviously needed help. Without much thought, they decided to give her a ride. On the way, they asked the hitchhiker where she was heading, and then dropped her off where she asked. It would seem that this good deed should have slightly diffused the atmosphere between the sisters, but as it turned out, it was quite the opposite. As soon as the unfortunate passenger left the car, a simply terrible quarrel broke out between Alexandria and Anastasia, and it happened in the most dangerous place on one of the sharp turns. Later, one of the eyewitnesses of these events told me that he saw with his own eyes how in the car that was passing by, two girls were furiously waving their arms, punching each other with their fists and pulling each other's hair. The guy was dumbfounded by such a sight because he realized that these actions distracted the driver from driving the car, and on a road like the Rab Tahana out at any moment. But despite the danger of the situation, the eyewitness realized that he could not help in any way. Everything happened so quickly that he wouldn't even have time to react. All he had left was to watch helplessly as the girl at the wheel suddenly accelerated sharply, turned the steering wheel to the left, and the car, breaking off the cliff, flew into the abyss. According to experts, the car fell from a height of about 60 meters and landed right on a pile of sharp stones. The most amazing thing is that it was the only area around the cliff where there was no water. It seems as if some unknown force specifically directed the car to this particular spot. From the strong impact, the car overturned and fell on its roof, so that its license plates were facing the sky. And you know, in this tragic situation, there is one moment that can be called a real miracle. It turns out that the girls were not driving some small car, but a Ford Explorer, a fairly large vehicle. Experts say that if they had been in a smaller car, they would have had practically no chance of surviving. News of the accident spread like wildfire through the surrounding area. The route leading to Hana is quite popular, so people began to gather around the scene of the incident. Everyone looked down in horror at the mangled car lying among the rocks. Someone even called the rescue service by dialing 911. And here the second amazing moment in this story happened. The people who had gathered on the cliff suddenly noticed that someone was moving in the car. It was an almost unbelievable piece of news. It turns out that after such a terrible fall, someone still survived. The police, who arrived at the scene of the accident, immediately began to question numerous witnesses, trying to find out what had happened. And one detail immediately caught their attention. It turns out that on the road surface, there were clearly visible traces of tires from the Dwayne sisters' car. But the strangest thing is that these traces had no signs of braking before the car flew off the cliff. On the contrary, everything indicated that the driver deliberately accelerated and directed the car straight to the edge of the cliff. You must agree that such things do not happen by chance. Meanwhile, rescuers were delivered by helicopter to the scene of the tragedy to check if anyone was left alive in the twisted car. What they saw in the car interior shocked even experienced experts. One of the sisters, Anastasia, was dead. Her body had numerous fractures, and one of the paramedics even compared it to a bag filled with bone fragments. But the real miracle was that the second sister, Alexandria, survived. True, she also had a lot of serious injuries, several broken ribs and a damaged arm. But despite everything, when the girl was pulled out of the wrecked car, she was able to stand on her own feet. And here we come to the most mysterious moment of this story. When the rescuers freed Alexandria from the car, they noticed that she had a lock of blonde hair clenched in her hand, the same color as her dead sister's hair. Most likely, this hair was torn out during the fight that the random eyewitness saw shortly before the accident. But what shocked the investigators the most was Alexandria's behavior. She did not look either frightened or upset about what had just happened. It seemed that the girl was not at all bothered by the fact that she had just miraculously escaped after the car fell from the cliff. And most oddly, she never once asked about her sister's condition, did not ask if Anastasia had survived. Alexandria did not cry, did not sob, did not show her emotions at all. You must agree that such a reaction is on the verge of normal, and it was this that made the investigators wonder. Does this terrible accident hide some terrible secret? Perhaps what happened on the road to Hana was not an accident. After that fatal accident, Alexandria was immediately taken to the hospital, and it was there that she was found by the police, who arrived to conduct an interrogation. From the very beginning, it was clear that the girl was not too willing to cooperate with the investigation. She reluctantly answered questions, and her whole demeanor indicated irritation and dissatisfaction with the presence of the officers. Just imagine the first thing she said to them was, "Why are you here?" You know, during my many years as a detective, I've interrogated a lot of witnesses and suspects, and usually people who have just experienced such a terrible tragedy behave differently. They may be shocked, scared, upset, but indifference is the last thing you expect in such a situation. And another detail that surprised me a lot during the entire conversation with the police officers, Alexandria never once asked about her sister's condition. No worries, no anxiety, absolutely nothing. In the end, the investigators had to inform the girl about Anastasia's death themselves. And you know what struck me the most? The complete absence of any reaction from Alexandria. She listened to this terrible news with a completely empty, indifferent look without a hint of emotion. You must agree that this is more like the behavior of a person who has long come to terms with the loss and not one who has just lost the closest person in an instant. But Alexandria's strange reaction is not the biggest surprise in this story. When the twins' father found out about the tragedy, his first words were, "It's a pity that the wrong sister died." That's right, you didn't mishear. The man actually regretted that Anastasia died in the accident and not Alexandria. Such an attitude towards one's own children is, to put it mildly, alarming. Meanwhile, the police continued the investigation and quickly found out that the sisters were fighting right in the car before the accident. This information made the investigators wonder, was the car's fall from the cliff actually Alexandria's deliberate act? Maybe she purposely directed the car towards the abyss to get rid of her sister. Even more suspicions were aroused by the results of the tests, which showed that the level of alcohol in Alexandria's blood was 3 times higher than the permissible norm. That is, the girl was actually heavily drunk behind the wheel and had no right to drive at all, let alone go on such a dangerous trip. The situation was complicated by the fact that at the time of the accident, the girls had no documents with them. It was because of this that the police had to rely on Alexandria's words to establish the identity of the deceased. And the girl, meanwhile, was forced to go home to find her ID and prove that she was indeed herself. The investigators also turned to Lonnie Dickerson, Alexandria's boyfriend, with a request to confirm her identity. When Lonnie was told about the accident and Anastasia's death, his reaction was no less strange than Alexandria's. It seemed that this news did not touch him at all. He just looked at the police officers with an empty, indifferent look. But Federico, Anastasia's boyfriend, was completely unaware of the tragedy. He was still waiting for the girls at the campsite, not understanding where they could have gone. Only the next morning, having got to his friend's place in Hana by hitchhiking, Federico learned the terrible truth. The news of his beloved's death was a real shock for him. The guy was extremely upset and confused, but suddenly remembered something. And believe me, this information greatly interested the investigation. Undoubtedly, the information provided by Federico was a real sensation for the investigation. He said that a week before the tragedy, Alexandria openly stated her intention to kill Anastasia. Moreover, at one point she even said, "I got rid of her," as if the murder had already happened. Such words could not but cause serious concern. True, Federico could not say for sure the reason why Alexandria wished death to her sister. But he suggested that there was a very strong rivalry and mutual jealousy between the girls because of each other's successes. It was hard for the twins to come to terms with the fact that they were so similar in appearance, and this forced them to constantly compete and oppose each other. Federico said that the sisters were constantly trying to outdo each other to prove their uniqueness. It was as if they wanted to tell the world, "Look, we may look like 2 peas in a pod, but we are different personalities." But despite this, the girls could not stay away from each other for long. Their relationship was a strange combination of love and hate, tenderness and aggression. When they were together, they constantly quarreled and insulted each other, but as soon as they were apart, they already missed their other half. But the strangest thing is that Federico recalled that once, after another heated argument, Alexandria told him, as if in passing, "My sister and I will leave this planet on the 30th. When the guy heard this, he thought that maybe the girls had decided to commit suicide together. But life went on as usual, and gradually this phrase was erased from Federico's memory. Upon hearing such a confession, the investigators became seriously alarmed. A terrible picture began to emerge in their heads. Alexandria deliberately drove the car into the abyss to kill her sister. Of course, one could assume otherwise, for example, that the girls decided to settle scores with life together, or that it was just a tragic coincidence, an accident. But something told the detectives that the answer lay precisely in Alexandria's words, which Federico heard. So the investigators decided to take a closer look at the Dwayne sisters' car. Fortunately, it was a new, modern car with many technical gadgets, and most importantly, it had a black box like in airplanes. This device records all information about the movement of the car, speed, maneuvers, change of direction, and so on. Thanks to the data from the black box, it was possible to find out an extremely important detail. At the moment the car fell, the brakes were not used. That is, the car was flying off the cliff at full speed. No one even tried to stop, or at least slow down. For the investigators, this was direct evidence that the accident was not an accident. Suspicions were intensified by the fact that the car fell into the abyss exactly where there were only sharp stones at the bottom and not water. It seemed as if someone had specifically chosen this spot for the fall. Moreover, it was here, on this stretch of road, that for some reason there was no protective fence. Everything seemed to come together for the implementation of someone's sinister plan. Experts made another interesting conclusion. Alexandria survived thanks to the deployment of airbags. But Anastasia was not so lucky. She jumped and bumped a lot in the cabin during the fall. Someone even suggested that if at the time of the accident the girl was pulling her sister by the hair, then Alexandria could quite possibly involuntarily turn the steering wheel and press the gas. Having received such testimony and evidence, the investigators decided to bring an official charge against Alexandria. There was only one question left: what motive pushed the girl to such a terrible act? It turns out that shortly before the tragedy, Federico and Anastasia were planning to open their own business on another Hawaiian island. And here we come to a possible motive for the crime. According to the testimony, Alexandria was extremely dissatisfied with the fact that her sister was going to leave her. The girl was so strongly opposed to parting with her twin that she may have decided to resort to the most radical measures. Having gathered all the circumstantial evidence, the investigation was finally able to bring an official charge against Alexandria, the intentional murder of her sister, that is, a second-degree crime. But when the police arrived to arrest the suspect, it turned out that she had already fled the house. It seems that the girl somehow guessed about the possible arrest and decided to hide from justice. But Alexandria apparently forgot about one simple thing: Maui is an island, and you can only leave it in two ways, by sea or by air. So it wasn't too difficult for the police to find out that the girl had booked a plane ticket and that her flight was about to depart. And you know, sometimes fate can be surprisingly ironic. By some coincidence, it was on this plane that a mechanical malfunction occurred and the departure had to be postponed. So instead of being hundreds of kilometers away from the crime scene, Alexandria was forced to stay very close, but she went to wait it out in a nearby hotel. And there she was eventually found and arrested by the police. During the preliminary hearing of the case, Alexandria did not plead guilty to the murder of her sister. And here I would like to draw your attention to one detail. In the footage from the courtroom, you can see that the suspect's hand was not bandaged, although she had previously complained about an injury. Some of those present even suggested that Alexandria could have exaggerated the severity of her injury in order to arouse sympathy from others. The day of the substantive trial came. A large jury gathered on Maui, and Alexandria was officially charged with killing her sister. For this, the girl was taken to Hawaii to personally face justice. The process began on January 29, 2018. At first, Alexandria looked very excited and scared. No wonder, after all, she was facing life imprisonment. One of the key witnesses in this case was the same random passerby who saw with his own eyes how the sisters were fiercely fighting in the car shortly before the accident. The man described in detail what he saw: how Anastasia pulled her sister by the hair, pulled her head to herself, and punched her with her fists. This testimony formed the basis of the defense's version, according to which Alexandria, being behind the wheel, could have lost control of the car from pain and shock. Allegedly not seeing the road clearly due to her sister's attack, the girl could have unintentionally directed the car into the abyss. Then Federico, the deceased Anastasia's boyfriend, was questioned on the witness stand. He spoke about Alexandria's strange and disturbing behavior after the tragedy. According to him, the girl tried to establish closer contact with him, suggested taking a shower together, began to wear her sister's things. Federico admitted that he was shocked and repelled by such actions. Despite the outward resemblance to his beloved, he categorically refused to get close to Alexandria. But despite all this testimony, the suspect's lawyers insisted that it was Anastasia who caused the fatal accident. Allegedly, by attacking her sister, she provoked her to rash actions. The defense also referred to the results of the examination, according to which the car's wheel was changed shortly before the accident, so one of the tires was completely smooth. Given that the road was wet that day, and the sister's car was initially swaying due to the fight inside the cabin, it could well have happened that Alexandria simply could not cope with driving on the slippery road. So the court faced a difficult question. What really happened that fatal day on the road to Hana? Was the accident really an accident caused by a combination of factors, or was there a malicious intent behind it? And most importantly, is Alexandria guilty of her sister's death? The answer to these questions was to be given by the jury. So after hearing all the available evidence, the judge reached a conclusion and announced his decision. According to it, Alexandria was not responsible for the accident and the death of her sister, and therefore she was immediately acquitted. In the judge's opinion, the accused lost control of the vehicle, and perhaps she did indeed turn on the left turn signal. But even if she did, the evidence shows that the car was being heavily shaken from side to side due to the fight inside the cabin. The judge noted that the mere probability that Alexandria could have driven the car into the abyss is not sufficient for a guilty verdict. This requires strong and indisputable evidence of intent, and in this case they were absent. Instead, eyewitness accounts and expert findings rather indicated that the accident was the result of a fatal coincidence of circumstances: bad weather conditions, a slippery road, lack of fencing in a dangerous area, and most importantly, a merciless fight between the sisters that distracted the driver from driving. As a detective, this court decision seems rather controversial to me. Is it possible to exclude intent in a situation where one sister openly threatened to kill the other? Can it be considered an accident that the crash occurred in the very place where there were only sharp rocks below? After all, isn't it strange that Alexandria, despite the death of her twin, behaved as if nothing special had happened? These questions will probably never have unambiguous answers. Opinions on Alexandria's guilt were divided. Some consider her a completely innocent victim of a tragic coincidence. For others, she remains the main suspect who managed to escape punishment by cunning. Alexandria herself insists on her non-involvement in what happened. According to her, she misses Anastasia very much and is deeply saddened by everything that happened. But whether she can be believed is another question. The Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles has a sinister reputation. Over nearly a century of its existence, it has been the site of numerous tragedies and mysterious events. But even against the backdrop of this grim history, the case of Eliza Lamb stands out. What happened to the 21-year-old Canadian student within the walls of the Cecil in 2013 still haunts those seeking the truth. The police investigated this case for a long time, but ultimately concluded that it was a suicide. However, there are far too many puzzling and suspicious elements in this story. It's all too easy to discern the outlines of a deliberate and brutal murder. So, what really happened to Eliza Lamb? Why was her body found where it was found? And most importantly, who killed her and why, if it was indeed a murder? Today, we will try to unravel this mysterious story and separate facts from speculation. Eliza Lamb, a 21-year-old girl originally from China, emigrated to Vancouver, Canada in 2003 with her family, consisting of her father, mother, and sister. Thanks to the large Chinese diaspora living in this city, adaptation was quick for all family members. Soon, the Lamb family rented a small Chinese restaurant and led a quiet, measured life. According to regular patrons of the establishment and neighbors, the immigrant family was welcoming and friendly. Eliza, a brown-eyed girl with dark hair, was fluent in English, although she had vision problems. She was a first-year student at the University of British Columbia, which ranks 40th among 17,000 universities worldwide. The girl was responsible and hardworking, working part-time on weekends and evenings in clothing stores, and later got a job at a bank. Eliza loved to travel, and even the lack of company did not stop her. She independently visited Washington State, Ottawa, Toronto, and Niagara Falls. She dreamed of going to Los Angeles and Hollywood in the near future. In December 2012, Eliza broke up with her boyfriend, and already in January 2013, the diligent student received a Christmas bonus. She told her sister about her desire to go to America to gain new experiences and get rid of the negative feelings associated with the breakup. The funds were there, and the parents did not object. The solo journey began in San Diego, where Eliza arrived on January 22nd, and on the 26th, the girl arrived in Los Angeles and settled in the Cecil Hotel. It is worth pausing at this point and telling the story of the hotel chosen by Eliza. The Cecil was built in the 1920s. It was a 15-story building designed for wealthy people and businessmen. However, the owners later changed their policy, renting out rooms for long periods at low prices. The hotel's reputation rapidly declined. From a pretentious, fashionable establishment, the Cecil turned into a cheap hotel that barely reached 3 stars. The hotel has repeatedly become the final refuge for suicides. In 1954, Helen Gurney, exhausted from fighting a serious illness, threw herself out of a 7th-floor window. In 1962, Julia Moore also jumped from an 8th-floor window due to pregnancy by a man who refused to acknowledge the child and a difficult financial situation. Pauline Otten jumped from a 9th-floor window after an argument with her husband. She fell on top of Giorgi Giannini, a passerby. Both died on the spot. Another dark page in the hotel's history was the murder of guest Goldie Osgood, who was found in her room in 1964, brutally beaten and raped. This crime remains unsolved. After the Eliza Lamb incident, journalists began to savor all these facts, calling the Cecil a hotbed of evil and otherworldly forces. But it is worth remembering that the hotel is located next to the troubled Skid Row area. In the 40s, half of all crimes in Los Angeles were committed there. This real tumor of the City of Angels attracted serial killers who simply wanted to be closer to their victims and get lost in the lists of cold cases. As for the suicides, everything is quite prosaic here as well. People who had financial and personal problems often stayed at the hotel with an unfortunate location and low prices. All suicide cases were investigated. Over 90 years of the Cecil's existence, only one murder occurred there, which is not that much. It is hardly possible to confidently state that the hotel is run by evil forces based on one case. This is a typical example of a cheap hotel where criminals and people with mental disorders sometimes stay. Finally, let's return to Eliza Lamb. She checked into the hotel on January 26th and intended to leave on February 1st. According to the employees, the girl behaved normally, did not demand anything, and spent most of her time outside the hotel. So it was not possible to establish exactly what Eliza was doing from January 26th to 29th. On the 29th, she left a text message on Tumblr. "I'm staying in a terrible hotel. By the word terrible, I mean tasteless. But it was built in 1928. It's Art Deco. So yeah, the hotel is cool. I think Baz Luhrmann should have filmed The Great Gatsby here." What Eliza did on January 30th is unknown. On the 31st, the staff saw her in the lobby. She was talking to her parents. Around noon, she visited a bookstore. On February 1st, Eliza did not call home. The girl had a particularly strong connection with her family. There was an agreement that she would call them every day, which she did with pleasure. After waiting until the evening of the first day of February, her father called Eliza himself. There was no answer. Then, around 8 in the evening, he called the reception. The duty manager reported that the stay at the hotel had expired on February 1st. Since the reservation was not extended, the staff vacated the room, and her belongings were waiting in the storage room. The manager did not know where their owner was. The Lamb family immediately went to the nearest police station. An officer helped them file a report dated the 1st. On February 4th, the case from the Los Angeles Missing Persons Department almost immediately went to the Homicide and Major Crimes Division. The reason for this decision is unknown, as there was no data on the commission of crimes against Eliza Lamb. Perhaps the police acted preemptively. Or maybe they found coincidences with previous crimes. In any case, the disappearance of the Canadian student was handled by detectives from the most prestigious and competent criminal investigation unit. On February 5th, they arrived at the hotel. On the same day, 2 dog handlers with dogs were called in and began to inspect the building. They even checked the technical floor. This floor could be reached by elevator, but it was impossible to exit without a special key. The roof, which was locked with an electronic lock, was also checked. The opening was recorded on the hotel security alarm panel. There was no data on unauthorized opening or lock breakage. The police decided to play it safe. Search activities involving dogs did not yield any results. Eliza's fate remained unknown. Detectives seized video recordings from the hotel's surveillance cameras, ATMs in the lobby and neighboring buildings, and street camera footage. They had to analyze 800 hours of video recordings from January 31st and February 1st. While viewing the video recordings, the police came across a stunning find. The camera captured the missing girl in the elevator a few hours before her death. Other cameras did not record Eliza Lamb leaving the hotel, so she remained inside. From the data that came from Canada, it became known about Eliza's diagnosed bipolar disorder. This is a veiled name for psychosis, which is characterized by an alternation of 2 states: lethargic, depressed, and excited active. The disease had a mild form, and according to the doctor, did not pose a danger to others or to Lamb herself. She took medication with her on the trip. On February 19th, the story of the missing Canadian student made an incredible zigzag. On the evening before and the morning of the 19th, several hotel guests complained about an unpleasant smell and strange color of the water. The Cecil Hotel had a personal water tower, 4 tanks with a volume of approximately 7,500 liters each, installed on the roof to maintain hydraulic pressure in case of water supply interruptions. The plumber decided to start checking the water quality with them. Inside one of the tanks, half filled with water, he found a floating body. According to him, this happened at 10 in the morning. At 12:49, a patrol officer officially reported that he saw a naked female body in the water. At approximately 1 o'clock, a whole column of firefighters and police officers began to pull the corpse out of the tank. Residents of Los Angeles watched the operation live. The television broadcast was conducted from helicopters of several TV channels. In addition, a whole flock of reporters settled on the roofs of neighboring buildings and near the entrance to the hotel. At 3:45, the body was pulled out of the tank. At 4 o'clock, the identity of the deceased was established. It turned out to be Eliza Lamb. No one doubted this. On the evening of the same day, all residents of the United States learned about the incident. In the water tank, where the female body swollen from decomposition was floating, they found black men's shorts size M, a green t-shirt size L, a set of black lace underwear, a pair of black sandals, a red fleece jacket size XS with a hood and zipper, a wristwatch, and a key card for the Cecil Hotel. The absence of important items is surprising. A wallet, phone, and glasses, which were never found either in the room or near the body. The autopsy, conducted by a forensic expert, brought quite intriguing results. Of the intravital bodily injuries, 2 skin defects were identified under the knees of both legs. Abrasions 2.5 centimeters long on the right leg and about 1 centimeter on the left. It was established that Eliza had sexual intercourse shortly before her death, and drowning did not fit the case of Eliza Lamb's death at all. On the inner side of the eyelids in the sclera, there were pinpoint hemorrhages, a sign of mechanical airway obstruction. The nasal passages were not blocked. This meant that after the body was removed from the water, there was no abundant discharge of foamy liquid from the lungs, and the release of foam is a significant sign of death by drowning. There was no water in the lungs, which means there was no reflex inhalation underwater. The girl got into the tank without breathing or with weakened superficial breathing. But Eliza Lamb's death was announced as a result of drowning. Thus, Lamb's death, which was not a drowning, was still declared a drowning. The police seized the medications that Eliza Lamb took on the trip. Trace amounts of drugs were found in the liver, but the peak of action had passed long before death. They did not cause the death. On June 21st, the Los Angeles police put a bold end to their investigation, concluding that Eliza Lamb committed suicide due to an exacerbation of bipolar disorder. Law enforcement agencies chose the path of least resistance, blaming the victim herself. How familiar this is. I wonder when they will start punishing law enforcement officers for negligence and unwillingness. Despite the fact that the Los Angeles police put an end to the investigation, recognizing Eliza Lamb's death as a suicide due to an exacerbation of bipolar disorder, the public was not quick to agree with this. There were too many strange and incomprehensible things in this story to simply take and believe the official version. Both journalists and people who were simply not indifferent to the event saw a mystical trail in it, the dark intervention of otherworldly forces. But is everything really so mysterious? Perhaps it is worth looking for a more rational explanation. Let's agree with the police conclusion for a minute and consider this case from the point of view of suicidology. People who are prone to suicide have certain characteristic signs of behavior that an experienced specialist will notice immediately. From 70% to 90% of potential suicides in one way or another inform their loved ones, relatives, friends, about their intentions. But Eliza Lamb did nothing of the sort, no alarming conversations or hints. Most women and girls who try to commit suicide do not die the first time. They either get scared at the last moment or just want to attract attention to themselves. Usually, the second or third attempt becomes fatal, although some practice this much longer. But Eliza, as far as is known, did not have any previous suicide attempts at all. The main reason for suicide is unbearable mental and physical pain that a person seeks to get rid of at all costs. But Eliza had a completely legal and effective way to deal with this: individually selected medications that she took under the supervision of a doctor. Why would she kill herself if the suffering could be overcome with medication? By the way, about the doctor. Eliza was being treated by the well-known psychiatrist Sarah Scarf, who had an impeccable reputation and many years of experience. There were never any complaints about her work, which means the diagnosis and therapy were correct. And if Eliza really had suicidal tendencies, Sarah Scarf would certainly have noticed it. After all, suicides, even unconsciously, give a lot of signals that an experienced specialist recognizes unmistakably. But the doctor was so confident in the stable condition of her patient that she calmly let her go on an independent trip abroad. She hardly would have done this if she had the slightest doubts. Yes, Eliza took the medications prescribed to her. So what? This is not at all an indicator of abnormality, rather the opposite. A person who follows the doctor's recommendations and regularly takes medication is usually quite adequate, able to control emotions and cope with stress. Moreover, with bipolar disorder, there are never hallucinations or delusions. Toxicological examination showed that on the eve of her death, Eliza did not drink alcohol or use drugs, and this could have exacerbated the manifestations of the disease. Another argument against suicide is the complete nudity of the body. Women who commit suicide never undress, because even in the last minutes of their lives, the thought that someone will lustfully examine their bodies is unbearable for them. But according to the official version, it turns out that Eliza undressed completely, threw all her clothes into a tank of water, and jumped in there herself. Isn't that strange? Moreover, death by drowning is terrible and painful. If the girl really wanted to end her life, she would have chosen something faster and simpler. Well, at least a jump from the roof. Fortunately, she was there. By the way, guests of this hotel who committed suicide usually jumped from windows, not drowned. Perhaps the key to this strange story lies in the video that captured Eliza Lamb's last minutes of life. The police released this recording on February 13th, but there is one nuance here. In fact, the camera took these shots not on January 31st between 2 and 3 o'clock, as officially stated, but in the first half of February 1st. This was done so that investigators could check the testimony of eyewitnesses about the girl's last day of life. That is, the recording that got on the internet is not the original. So, the recording that got on the internet and caused such a stir is not actually the original. Before making the video public, forensic experts worked on it a lot. Some fragments were slowed down, some were accelerated, the date and time were hidden, and individual moments were cut out. Perhaps this was done because someone who was next to Eliza in her last hours got into the frame, and the investigation decided to hide this information. But even from this castrated video, certain conclusions can be drawn. Let's start with the fact that the girl enters the elevator on the 14th, the highest of the residential floors. She leans towards the buttons, presses them along with the door hold button. She is wearing the same clothes that will later be found at the bottom of the water tank. There are no glasses or, it seems, contact lenses on her. Eliza has to lean over to see the numbers on the buttons. The girl's movements are unhurried. She calmly stands in the corner of the cab. Analysis of her nonverbal behavior proves that Eliza is in a relaxed state, not feeling fear or anxiety. This is evidenced by the position of her arms and legs. It seems that she is waiting for someone, but some time passes, and no one enters the elevator. Then, Eliza approaches the exit, quickly looks out into the corridor, presses herself against the wall, almost in the same place where she was standing before. And a second later, she abruptly steps towards the elevator control panel, presses her back against the wall, as if she wants to be in the zone of invisibility. This maneuver looks more playful than anxious. Body language reveals embarrassment, but not fear at all. However, no one looked into the elevator, so after a short wait, Eliza slowly looks out into the corridor again, watching the part of it to the right of the elevator. The girl glances to the left, probably assuming that the one she was waiting for had already passed while she was hiding in the corner. Then, she jumps out of the elevator on both legs. Experts regarded these actions as foolishness, a game. Eliza clearly did not feel danger and was not really hiding. Further, remaining in the corridor, the girl moves to the left edge of the doors and disappears from the camera's view for a moment. Then, in the frames, you can see the edge of her skirt and part of her shoulder. Eliza slowly raises her arms above her head. Most likely, she is fixing her hair. Analysts see these actions as an expression of sexual interest. Having dealt with her hair, she returns to the elevator. Her arms are widely spread. Lamb is trying to calm down. She is in a state of strong emotional excitement. Many experts note that at this moment, Eliza, strange as it may seem, is laughing. The violent reaction is caused by the fact that someone made her laugh. Again, leaning towards the panel, Eliza begins to press the buttons with both hands. At the end, she presses the door hold again, makes a 1-second pause, and another series of pressing and holding. Having finished with the buttons, the girl exits the elevator, slowly fixing her hair. Opposite the exit is a mirror, and preening in front of it does not at all fit with fear or anxiety. When exiting, Eliza puts her elbows forward. This is how she tries to appear more confident. She stands to the left of the doorway, and although the resolution of the recording is low, experts discerned Lamb is smiling. Perhaps not quite sincerely. Further, the analysis of nonverbal behavior records, the level of insincerity increases along with the level of anxiety. One of the markers is Eliza touching her shoulder with her fingertips. It is clearly visible how she leans over, as if talking to someone standing to the right of the elevator doors. At the same time, the girl actively gesticulates. Experts note excessive playfulness, a playful mood. There are no signs of fear. The eerie moment seems unnatural, only because it is here that the recording was slowed down. Let's not forget that it was worked on a lot. Eliza rises several times on the toes of her right foot. This indicates a remarkable optimism, maybe even joy. And again, sexual interest is noted. It all ends with the girl leaving the camera's field of view in the direction opposite to where her interlocutor was standing. The recording continues, and we see the elevator doors close and open twice. It is difficult to imagine that one can experience such emotions and perform such actions alone. As you know, mentally ill people, being in the grip of hallucinations, demonstrate specific motor skills. But nothing of the sort was observed in Eliza's behavior. Most likely, shortly before the described events, she met someone, perhaps even had a romantic relationship. On the video, the girl is playing hide-and-seek with her invisible companion. And although sometimes she shows some embarrassment, most likely, this is due to the fact that the acquaintance was short-lived, so Eliza felt a certain constraint and shyness. But definitely not fear. Almost throughout the entire recording, an element of play, flirting, sexual attraction is clearly visible in the girl's behavior, and only the realization that we are seeing her last minutes of life gives the video an eerie tinge. But in itself, this footage does not contain anything frightening. So, the conclusion suggests itself. There was someone else next to Eliza, someone who knew about the surveillance camera in the elevator and carefully avoided its gaze. Someone who knew that, by some strange coincidence, the video surveillance in the corridor of the 14th floor, which usually worked constantly, was turned off this time. So this someone could freely communicate with Eliza without fear of being noticed. What happened next? Let's turn to the plan of the 14th floor. On it we see A. Smokeless fire escapes, B. Internal fire escapes, one of which leads to the technical floor, and the other to the roof. The doors to the internal stairs are locked with an electronic lock. It is impossible to open them unnoticed by the security. At that time, no attempts to pass through these doors were recorded. There remain the smokeless stairs mounted on the outer walls of the hotel. They can be used to reach the roof without much effort. This has been repeatedly proven by bloggers and journalists who penetrated there in this way. There were no obstacles to this. Only desire and a little courage were needed. If you perceive this as a romantic adventure, especially in the company of a person to whom you feel sympathy, then it can even be fun. It is quite possible that such a proposal caused Eliza the joy that can be noticed in several moments of the video recording. Most likely, the girl met her future killer even before February 1st, and it is just as likely that she voluntarily agreed to intimate closeness with him, as well as to climb to the roof together. Maybe she even undressed of her own free will. Until some fatal moment, Eliza's relationship with her killer was playful and quite friendly. And then some incident provoked an acute conflict. Murderers often commit crimes under the influence of aggression that arises in response to actions or words that are unacceptable to them. For serial killers, this is doubly true. They attack not every potential victim, but only the one whose behavior seems offensive to them. It seems that Eliza's killer did not torture or mock her. Most likely, he used a chokehold with his forearm, a technique from which even an adult man loses consciousness in just 15 seconds. This method has two important features. Firstly, it does not leave visible traces, and secondly, it leads to rapid loss of consciousness without the ability to resist. Having strangled Eliza, the criminal raised her unconscious body to the tank roof, using a ladder that was always stored there. This explains the absence of the girl's fingerprints on the stairs, and then, through the hatch, he lowered her into the water. Recall, Eliza was strangled, as indicated by pinpoint hemorrhages on the inner side of the eyelids and sclera found during the autopsy. At the same time, her mouth was not forcibly closed. Otherwise, there would have been injuries from the teeth on the inner side of the lips. No significant amount of water got into the lungs, which means there was no deep reflex inhalation underwater. Eliza ended up in the tank, either completely without breathing or with weakened superficial breathing. After that, the killer searched her clothes, taking the money, phone, and glasses. He had to get rid of the phone. It could have contained their correspondence and photos. He probably spent the money and kept the glasses as a trophy. Having searched the clothes, the criminal threw it into the same tank. He did not try to imitate suicide. He just hid the body. The person who killed Eliza Lamb is cold-blooded, prudent, and has experience in such matters. Perhaps she had already committed similar crimes before. The killer perfectly understood what the police would pay attention to and how he should act in order to remain unnoticed. It is possible that he knew. Water will destroy biological traces. If you look at the circumstances of Eliza Lamb's death without bias, it becomes obvious that this is not at all like suicide. Did the Los Angeles police investigators not understand this? No, they were perfectly aware of everything. It's just that the reason they decided not to open a criminal case was extremely pragmatic. After all, if there is a bullet, there must be a gun. If there is a stab wound, there must be a knife somewhere. This is how murders usually happen. But when there is something incomprehensible, vague, something that is difficult to prove, it is better to close the case at the stage of inquiry. Why waste effort and time on searches that may turn out to be in vain? Even if this murder was committed by a maniac, it is worth waiting for the next episode in order to understand the criminal's model of action. By the way, a similar crime occurred just a month later. In Los Angeles, even without Eliza Lamb, there are enough murdered women. Police resources should not be spent on an investigation that is minimally likely to end in a court verdict. Statistics require an increase in crime detection rates. Eliza Lamb's parents demanded compensation from the hotel for negligence. After all, unhindered access to the roof still exists. But negligence can be seen in this story literally in everything. Many questions remain for the investigation. Can we assert that everything happened exactly as described above? Of course not. This is just one version. Yes, there are huge databases that describe the typical behavior of murderers. They work well as an example. But can we say with certainty that the criminals who are caught are similar to those who are still at large? Perhaps the police catch those who have primitive motivation? What if they ended up behind bars precisely because of the predictability of their actions? It is quite probable that Eliza became the victim of someone whose actions cannot be explained. We can only hope that someday the truth will come out. This story took place in the small town of Conyers, Georgia. The officer immediately called for backup and medical assistance at the scene of the tragedy. Arriving at the address Tasmay provided, the police saw another girl near the house, an exact copy of Tasmay. As it turned out, they were twin sisters, Tasmia and Jasmia. The girls were in a state of shock from what they had seen. They were immediately given first aid, trying to calm and stabilize them. Meanwhile, a group of police officers entered the house to examine the crime scene. Right from the doorstep, their attention was drawn to a long bloody trail stretching from the door to the street. Judging by everything, the victim had tried to escape from the attacker, but he caught up with her and dragged her back into the house to finish his bloody deed. What the cops saw inside shocked even seasoned officers. On the floor, walls, and even the ceiling were brown bloodstains, evidence of a brutal massacre. It seemed as if someone had deliberately splattered blood all over the house. In my years of service, I've seen many crime scenes, but this picture was one of the most terrifying. The officers carefully examined the house room by room, searching for the victim's body and any evidence that could shed light on the identity of the killer. Eventually, in one of the rooms, they found what they were looking for: the mutilated body of 33-year-old Nikki Whitehead, the mother of the twin girls. I can't help but note the diligence with which the killer tried to cover up the traces of his crime. The entire house was literally flooded with blood, but it was clear that someone had tried to clean up, albeit unsuccessfully. To completely cleanse the crime scene in such a short time was practically impossible. Later, Officer Chrisman, one of the first to arrive on the call, admitted that in his entire career he had never seen such a bloody scene. This place made a depressing impression even on hardened cops. During the house search, the body of 33-year-old Nikki Whitehead, the mother of the twin girls, was found in one of the rooms. She was lying in the bathtub in a pool of her own blood. The woman had become a victim of a brutal attack. Her body was literally riddled with numerous stab wounds. Especially horrifying was the fact that the victim's spinal cord was practically severed. It seemed as if the killer had struck this area with particular fury. The expert who arrived at the crime scene counted about 80 stab wounds on the deceased's body. It's hard to even imagine the agony the poor woman endured before her death. It was also strange that the towels from the bathroom had disappeared somewhere. Later, they were found in the washing machine, soaked in blood. It looks like the killer tried to get rid of these pieces of evidence, but in a hurry just shoved them into the machine. On the same day, a criminal case was opened under the murder article, and an active search for the perpetrator began. The first to come under the scrutiny of the investigation were the victim's daughters Tasmia and Jasmia. During interrogation, the girls said that the house where they lived belonged to a man named Robert Head, with whom their mother had a relationship. But as it turned out, Robert was not Nikki's only admirer. The girls recalled overhearing their mother repeatedly talking on the phone with some Nikki Joe, especially when Head wasn't around. This fact interested the investigators and required further verification. Was Robert Head involved in the murder? What role did the mysterious Nikki Joe play? And most importantly, who actually committed this terrible act? Now I'm going to tell you all about this in detail, but only for those wonderful and amazing people who subscribe to the channel right now, like this video, and leave any comment on it. Help me spread this story so people can draw conclusions from this shocking case. So, during the interrogation of the victim Nikki Whitehead's daughters, new details of her personal life were revealed. Tasmia and Jasmia said that they had repeatedly heard their mother talking on the phone with some Nikki Joe, especially when her cohabitant Robert Head was not around. Interestingly, the girls themselves never saw Joe, including on the day of the tragedy. But the most intriguing fact was that on the eve of the murder, Nikki spoke again with this mysterious man, and then a serious quarrel broke out between them, after which the woman angrily slammed down the receiver. This detail immediately caught my attention as a detective. After all, it is quite possible that during that conversation, Nikki told her admirer about her desire to end their relationship, and such a decision could well become a motive for murder. How many times in my practice have I encountered similar situations a rejected lover commits a crime out of jealousy or resentment? Therefore, this version definitely needed to be checked. The police quickly found Nicky Joe and invited him for questioning. The man was genuinely surprised to learn the reason for the summons. He categorically denied his involvement in the murder and claimed that despite the one-sidedness of his feelings and the fact that Nicky kept him at a distance, he sincerely loved this woman and would never harm her. Joe confirmed that on the eve of the tragedy, he and Nicky really had a quarrel, but assured that it was a minor dispute over a misunderstanding, which was quickly settled. Moreover, according to him, for the entire day of January 13, he had an ironclad alibi that completely ruled out the possibility of committing this terrible crime. Well, Nicky Joe's interrogation left more questions than answers. If it wasn't him, then who was it? Another version began to form in my head. What if the murder was committed by Robert Head, the man Nicky Whitehead was living with at the time of the tragedy? Perhaps he found out about her secret communication with another man and decided to brutally take revenge on his unfaithful cohabitant. However, the version about Robert Head's involvement in the murder was quickly dropped. During the investigation, it was established that the man worked as a long-distance trucker and on the day of the tragedy was on a business trip in another state. So purely physically, he could not have been present at the crime scene and committed this terrible act. And so the cops found themselves at a dead end again. On the one hand, there was the mutilated body of a victim who died a terrible death. On the other hand, there was a complete absence of suspects or leads that could put us on the trail of the killer. As an experienced detective, I understood that in such cases you need to act methodically and not miss a single detail. The first thing law enforcement did was thoroughly search the crime scene and collect all possible evidence from blood traces to fingerprints and microfibers. All these samples were sent to the laboratory for examination. While they were waiting for the analysis results, it was decided to delve deeper into the personal life of Nicky Whitehead. It was necessary to find out who the deceased communicated with, what places she visited, what she was passionate about. The detectives were especially interested in the last weeks and days before the murder. Perhaps that's where the key to this horrifying story was hidden. And then Nicky's daughters Jasmia and Tasmia came to mind. After all, who could know more about a woman's life than her own children? The girls were the closest people to their mother and could remember some details or events that would help track down the criminal. The police decided to take the sisters to the station and carefully question them there in a calm environment. Of course, the girls had just experienced a terrible tragedy and were in a state of shock. On the way to the station, one of the patrolmen noticed Tasmia's strange behavior. She kept biting her hands hard until they bled. Her sister Jasmine explained that for Tasmia, this is a usual way to cope with nervous tension, especially in stressful situations. Like now, after such a shock, this is a completely normal reaction. During the interrogation, the detective began to have a vague, alarming feeling. At first, he attributed it to professional intuition, which often helped in investigations, but over time this feeling only intensified. First, the detective found it extremely suspicious that Tasmia and Jasmia seemed to be crying, but at the same time there was no trace of tears on their faces. It seemed as if they were squeezing out this cry, playing to the audience, which was quite strange given the circumstances. Secondly, the detective could not help but notice how the girls spoke about their deceased mother. In their words, there were harsh, even offensive epithets about Nicky. You know, usually children who have just lost their parents remember them with special tenderness and even some idealization. But here everything was different. It seemed as if the girls were talking about some stranger, or even a person they hated. And this led to certain thoughts. The longer the interrogation lasted, the more the detective became convinced that the sisters were hiding something. Whether out of fear or for some other reasons, but their testimonies constantly had some kind of understatement and contradictions. And this made us think, what if they themselves were somehow involved in this horrific story? In the end, the team of investigators decided to separate the girls and interrogate each one individually. Of course, they began to resist, begging not to separate them, but the investigators were adamant. Although it's not very pleasant to separate sisters who have just experienced such a tragedy, the interests of the investigation required this step. By the way, another interesting nuance: Tasmia and Jasmia did not take off their gloves the whole time, even inside the police station. At first glance, it's a trifle, but in the context of the investigation, every detail can be important. So after completing the interrogation of Tasmia and Jasmia, the cops had a mixed impression. On the one hand, the girls seemed to be frank and admitted that lately their relationship with their mother had been, to put it mildly, strained. They even confessed that they sometimes thought about Nikki's death, but at the same time they insisted that they were not involved in the murder. On the other hand, it seemed that they were still hiding something. There were too many inconsistencies when comparing their testimonies obtained during separate interrogations. It's like putting together a puzzle, the pieces of which just won't fit together. And such a mismatch usually indicates a lie or concealment. Suspicions about the sisters only intensified after one incident. After the interrogation, the girls were sitting in the department room, hugging each other and seemingly crying. One of the employees, taking pity on them, approached and sympathetically asked if he could help them with something, do something for them. And then the unexpected happened. The sisters replied that they would like to watch TV. This moment just threw me off balance. Usually, children who have just lost their mother under such terrible circumstances are under such stress that TV is not even a question. But here, as if nothing had happened, life goes on as usual. Such a reaction seems somehow unnatural, and it only heightened the doubts of law enforcement officers. In the end, the investigators came to the conclusion that it was necessary to talk with the entourage of the Whitehead family, their friends, neighbors, acquaintances, to ask them about how Nikki's relationship with her daughters was, what were the nuances of their family life. And you know, the very first conversations opened their eyes to many things. It turned out that during the interrogation, the girls significantly smoothed out the severity of intrafamily conflicts, presenting everything as if there were problems, but not too serious ones. However, reality turned out to be much gloomier. To begin with, Nikki Whitehead herself was not born in the most favorable conditions. At the time of giving birth, her mother was serving a sentence in prison for distributing prohibited psychotropic substances, so the little one was taken care of by her grandmother Della Frazier. The woman felt very sorry for the girl, believed that she was already unlucky with the imprisoned mother, so from childhood she indulged all the whims of her granddaughter. When Nikki grew up, she repeatedly got involved with bad company and came to the attention of the police. Fortunately, somehow it did without serious consequences, but the fact remains the childhood and youth of the future victim were far from ideal. As for Della Frazier herself, after the detectives communicated with her, the impression was formed that this woman was excessively indulgent to the antics of her granddaughters. Perhaps she loved them in her own way, but she absolutely did not know how to keep them within the framework of discipline to resist their whims. So the girls got used to the fact that their grandmother allows and indulges everything. All this only emphasizes the unhealthy atmosphere in which the sisters grew up. As it turns out, at the age of 17, she gave birth to twins Tasmia and Jasmia. Almost nothing was known about the girls' father, only that shortly after their birth, he married another woman and moved to Canada, actually leaving the children to fend for themselves. According to eyewitnesses, despite her young age, Nikki sincerely rejoiced in motherhood and loved her daughters very much. But the trouble was that without a job and her own housing, the young mother was forced to give the little ones to her grandmother for upbringing, and she herself went to earn money. In fact, for several years she disappeared from the life of Tasmia and Jasmia, only rarely visiting them and sending money. But the immediate upbringing of the girls was carried out exclusively by the grandmother. Interestingly, despite such difficult circumstances, the sisters grew up to be very smart and diligent. According to teachers at school, they demonstrated remarkable success, were excellent students. In addition, they were engaged in art circles, participated in the Scout movement. And Della Frazier herself did not hide that she dreams of a brilliant future for her granddaughter's admission to prestigious universities, a decent career. It would seem that despite her daughter's early pregnancy and her irresponsibility, the woman managed to raise the girls properly. But as often happens, behind the screen of well-being, a completely different reality was hidden. After talking with family acquaintances, the investigators realized that Della made the same mistake that she once did with Nikki. She brought up her granddaughters in an atmosphere of permissiveness and indulgence of whims. That is, if at school the girls behaved flawlessly, then at home they did not listen to their grandmother at all, did not recognize any rules or restrictions, and the woman could do nothing about it. But the real problems began when Whitehead appeared in Nikki's life. Although the man was much older than her, Nikki sincerely fell in love with him and soon moved in with him. And then she decided to take her daughters to live with her, filing a corresponding lawsuit in court. And the court sided with her when the girls were 7 years old. They moved to their mother and her new cohabitant. It would seem that finally the children were reunited with their own mother. They had a full-fledged home. But not everything was so cloudless. Robert, who worked as a long-distance trucker, was often away. And while he was absent, the girls seemed to break loose. Accustomed to permissiveness at their grandmother's, now they took Nikki's attempts to discipline them, to teach them at least some rules with hostility. They openly rebelled against the routine established by their mother, although in fact it was quite reasonable lessons, limited time for walks, no gadgets before bed, and so on. But the girls were not going to put up with such oppression. According to neighbors, they tried in every possible way to circumvent their mother's prohibitions, and when she discovered disobedience, they quarreled with her through tantrums. It got to the point that Nikki began to take away phones from her daughters and forbid them to watch TV for their misdeeds. For girls who were used to freemen at their grandmother's, this was a real drama, and they openly declared that they were not going to endure it. So slowly, day by day, the conflict between mother and daughters only escalated, and I understood that this discord could result in something worse than just quarrels and tantrums. It remained only to guess how far could the girls go to finally throw off the maternal shackles. Be that as it may, Nikki Whitehead did not give up. Even at 25, having become the mother of 2 already adult girls, she tried to build the right model of life for them. Yes, sometimes it was not easy for her, and the methods were sometimes too harsh, but the woman sincerely strove to give her daughters what she herself did not receive at their age. Having obtained custody of the children, Nikki immediately established clear rules. Right after school lessons, time for walks and entertainment was strictly limited. At night, no phones or other gadgets. Complete obedience and submission to the mother. For any offense, punishment, from confiscation of equipment to a ban on watching TV. For girls who had lived for years in the permissiveness of their grandmother's upbringing, this came as a real culture shock. At some point, Robert Head, Nikki's cohabitant, witnessed one of these quarrels, and then a completely different relationship developed between him and the girls. When the man was at home, they behaved restrainedly, even a little afraid of him. But as soon as Robert left for another trip on a long-distance truck, the sisters seemed to break loose. Conflicts with their mother literally happened every day. The woman desperately tried to cope with her rebellious daughters, but where they're in her hands, they openly laughed at her attempts to educate them, to set some kind of framework. This daily struggle drained Nikki morally and physically. She was torn between work and the constant need to rein in her disobedient girls. But even then, the thought occurred to me, was this pedagogy limited only to moral pressure and strict punishments? Perhaps in the heat of another conflict, it even came to assault. At least some family acquaintances hinted that sometimes quarrels moved into a dangerous phase. But what really happened there behind closed doors remained only to guess. It would seem that after so many conflicts and even police intervention, the situation should have somehow improved. But no, the quarrels between Nikki and her daughters only escalated. Once, after another call, my colleagues again came to the Whitehead house, and they found a familiar picture there. A frightened Nikki claimed that her daughters had attacked her with their fists as soon as the door closed behind the police. However, something didn't add up in this story. When the cops went upstairs to the sisters' room, they unanimously assured that it was their mother who attacked them, not the other way around. Only the girls' words sounded extremely unconvincing. Unlike Nikki, whose hands were covered with fresh scratches and bruises, there was not a single abrasion on Tasmia and Jasmia, and this led to certain reflections. In the end, the girls were taken to the police station that day, and later a trial was held over them. Having weighed all the circumstances, the servants of Themis came to the conclusion that it would be better for the daughters to return to the care of their grandmother, and they should be temporarily isolated from Nikki. It was thought that Della Frazier would be able to curb her unruly granddaughters. But no, even this indulgent woman could not handle the sisters who had completely gotten out of hand. They openly neglected her authority, did everything their own way, regardless of comments or requests. And with age, their behavior became more and more aggressive. The girls repeatedly came to the attention of the police due to minor offenses and clashes. At the same time, Della continued to desperately make excuses for them, despite the obviousness of the problem. The woman sincerely loved her granddaughters and justified them in everything. But child protection specialist understood. The elderly Mrs. Frazier no longer has the strength and ability to raise 2 teenagers with such deviations. Someone was needed who could take the girls under strict but fair control. And then all eyes again turned to Nikki Whitehead. Despite all the complexity of her relationship with her daughters, she remained their mother and great hopes were pinned on her. So at the beginning of 2010, when the sisters turned 16, another court session took place. Its verdict was as follows. The girls must return to their mother for 2 weeks, a kind of probationary period. There were rumors that during this time, the supervisory authorities repeatedly visited Nikki's house to make sure that everything was okay, and allegedly there were no changes. The girls remained just as disobedient and problematic. However, the guardianship specialists stubbornly turned a blind eye to this. They hoped that during these 2 weeks, the daughters would somehow come to an understanding with their mother, find a common language. But as it turned out, Tasmia and Jasmia themselves were extremely dissatisfied with this decision. They unanimously declared that they did not want to live under the same roof with Nikki, that they preferred to stay with their grandmother. It seemed that the prospect of spending at least a few weeks with their own mother caused them almost panic fear. And in my opinion, such a reaction was very indicative. But no matter how much the girls protested, no one listened to them. Everyone around stubbornly believed that these 2 weeks would be fateful for the Whitehead sisters, that it was during this time that they would finally come to an understanding with their mother, begin a new life as a normal, healthy family. How could they have imagined then what a horrific surprise awaited them in the near future? And so, after long vicissitudes and disputes, Tasmia and Jasmia still found themselves in the house of their mother Nikki Whitehead and her cohabitant Robert Head. The girls had just turned 16 and they were to spend 2 fateful weeks with their mother, a kind of probationary period that was to determine their future life. But fate decreed otherwise. Just 8 days after the start of this experiment, the irreparable happened. Nikki was found dead in her own home. The woman became a victim of a brutal murder, the circumstances of which shocked even seasoned police officers. Since all the evidence against the Whitehead sisters was indirect and circumstantial, the girls had to be released. They returned to their adored grandmother and at first glance began to live their usual life, the same as they led before their mother took them to live with her for the last time. According to relatives and neighbors, the girls became simply inseparable. If before they spent a lot of time together anyway, now they did not leave each other for a single step at all, as if they were afraid of getting lost or losing that invisible but strong sisterly bond. But the change in their behavior was most striking. If before the tragedy Tasmia and Jasmia were rather noisy and problematic girls, now they behaved quietly and calmly. Against the backdrop of accusations and gossip that rained down on them after their mother's death, the sisters seemed to be trying to become as inconspicuous as possible. At school, they almost stopped communicating with their peers. Immediately after classes, they hurried home. It seemed that the girls deliberately avoided any contact with the outside world, as if fearing unwanted attention to their persons. Meanwhile, the investigation into the murder of Nikki Whitehead was delayed for many months. The investigation carefully collected and checked all possible evidence, interviewed witnesses, put forward versions. But despite all efforts, the case did not budge for a long time. It seemed as if the criminal had not left a single trace, a single clue that could be grasped. And so in May, the results of the examinations of the evidence collected at the crime scene finally came. For me, they did not become some kind of revelation, rather. They only confirmed those suspicions that arose immediately after acquaintance with the case. First, the bite marks on the hands of Tasmia and Jasmia perfectly matched the dental impressions of their murdered mother. Remember the episode when Tasmia suddenly began to bite her hand in the police car as if from severe stress? As it turned out, she did it not at all because of nervous tension. It was a desperate but extremely stupid way to mask the traces of her mother's teeth on her skin. Secondly, 2 boxes with their shoes were found in the sisters' room, on which traces of Nikki Whitehead's blood were clearly visible, and also that missing stack of towels from the bathroom, which I mentioned earlier. It was found stuffed into the washing machine, soaked in blood not only of the victim, but also of the twins themselves. These and other facts eloquently testified that it was not some mysterious malefactors who were involved in Nikki's death, but 2 people dear to her, Tasmia and Jasmia, teenagers whom she so desperately tried to curb and put on the true path. Her own daughters. The only question that remained somewhat vague was the distribution of the sisters' roles in the commission of the crime. DNA examination was powerless to determine to which of the twins certain biological traces belonged. However, I had practically no doubt that the girls acted together and deliberately. The murder of the mother was not some tragic coincidence. It was planned and implemented as a well-organized and thought-out crime. Of course, the young age and the stunning cruelty of the deed could raise doubts. Are these delicate 16-year-old creatures really capable of such brutality? But unfortunately, my many years of practice show that anyone is capable of murder. And if a person has already decided to cross the line of law and morality, age and gender do not play the main role at all. Additional confirmation of this version was the video recording from the surveillance cameras of the school where the girls studied. It clearly shows how on the day of the murder, January 13, Tasmia and Jasmia enter the educational institution together at 10:17 in the morning. That is, in fact, they are late for half of the lessons. This raised a lot of questions. After all, if everything was as the sisters told at first, they should have left the house at 7:30 and, in the worst case, been late for some half an hour. Instead, we see the absence of girls in several classes in a row. and this leads to certain reflections. What were they doing all this time? Where were they and what were they doing instead of sitting at their desks? Of course, at first the thought arose that Tasmia and Jasmia could simply skip classes like many other teenagers. But in the context of all the circumstances, this version looked unlikely. Unfortunately, it looked much more like the girls spent the morning hours implementing their horrific plan. Realizing the seriousness of the suspicions and the evidence collected, on May 21, our group went to the Whitehead sister school. Right on the territory of the educational institution, in front of the stunned students and teachers, the detention of Tasmia and Jasmia took place. The girls were placed in an official car to be taken to the police station for further investigative actions, and here we witnessed a striking change in the behavior of the sisters. If earlier they pretended to be frightened and confused victims of circumstances, now they seemed to have dropped their masks. In the police car, the girls began to behave defiantly, even aggressively. They unanimously declared their non-involvement in the crime, accusing the cops of deliberately appointing them guilty in order to close the high-profile case as soon as possible. Even being in the police station, in the interrogation room, the sisters stubbornly refused to admit their guilt. It seemed that neither the iron evidence nor the psychological pressure was able to break through this wall of defiant silence. Tasmia and Jasmia sat side by side, tightly pursing their lips and looking at one point. In their eyes, one could read not only fright, but also some strange determination like that of people who have already made a fateful decision. Looking back, I think it was at that moment that we all finally saw the true face of the Whitehead sisters. Not frightened children, not victims of circumstances, but two young individuals capable of a brutal and insidious crime. Cold-blooded, prudent murderers despite their 16 years. On July 12, after a thorough study of all the evidence and circumstances of the case, Tasmia and Jasmia were officially charged for the premeditated murder of their mother, Nikki. The girls were taken into custody before the trial. Without the right to bail, the charges against them were too serious. But the most interesting thing happened a little later. Realizing that the weight of evidence against them was irrefutable, the sisters suddenly decided to confess, and what they told during the next interrogation made even us, seasoned police officers, shudder. According to the girls, when their stepfather Robert was away, Nikki often drank. Moreover, she did it not like a normal person who wants to relax with a glass of wine, but abused it in a big way. Tasmia and Jasmia even suggested that sometimes their mother indulged in illegal substances, so inadequate was her behavior at such moments. With tears in their eyes, the sisters told how their drunken mother picked on them for any reason, provoked scandals out of the blue, and also that even when sober, Mickey was very cold and detached with them. The girls did not see any warmth or maternal love from her. Furthermore, on the eve of the tragedy, another drunken quarrel occurred. Nikki, pretty tipsy, began to yell at her daughters, calling them names. The scandal lasted almost until the morning, and only in the morning, tired, they all fell asleep. But they were not destined to rest. Just a few hours later, Nikki again burst into the girls' room and began to wake them up. They say it's time for school. At the same time, she carelessly poked them with a spoon and mumbled something about studying and responsibilities. And when the sisters went down to the kitchen to have breakfast, another conflict broke out over nothing. Then the sisters told quite terrible things about how they, unable to withstand the bullying, attacked their mother with a knife, how they dealt blow after blow until she fell dead, how they dragged the bloody body to the bathroom to somehow cover their tracks, how they washed the floor with towels but still could not remove all the blood. And after this horrific cleaning, the girls simply changed clothes, hid their shoes with traces of blood away, and, as if nothing had happened, went to school. When asked why they did not immediately tell the truth, the sisters did not give a clear answer. They only shrugged their shoulders and looked away. At the trial, Tasmia and Jasmia fully admitted their guilt. Without unnecessary emotions or attempts to justify themselves, they simply confirmed everything that they said during the interrogations. For the premeditated murder of their mother, the Whitehead sisters were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Their lawyer stated that such a sentence gives the girls hope for the future. They say, if they had not admitted guilt, the term could have been much tougher. Interestingly, even after being behind bars, the sisters managed to finish their schooling. Their grandmother, Della Frazier, was present even at the graduation. Despite all the horror of what her granddaughters did, the old woman continues to love and support them. An amazing woman, in my opinion. In 2017, Tasmia and Jasmia filed a petition for parole, but fortunately they were denied. If they do not receive more parole, they will be released only in 2044 when both will already be 47. I hope that during this time they will realize the full weight of their crime and repent. although to be honest, it's hard to believe in it. This is such a terrible and eerie story, friends. A story about how hatred and cruelty can poison even the closest people. About how important it is to notice the alarming signs in time and react to them. And that nothing in this world justifies such a brutal crime, not even teenage maximalism or difficult family relationships.